There is a date that almost nobody knows. It sits in the scientific literature, confirmed by multiple independent laboratories, cross-checked against sediment cores and optically stimulated luminescence tests, and ancient DNA analysis. It has been published in peer-reviewed journals. It has been discussed at international conferences. It has been cited in UNESCO heritage documents. And yet, if you went to almost any school on Earth in the last 100 years and sat in a history class, you would never have heard it. The date is 65,000 years before the present. That is when human beings first arrived on the continent we now call Australia. 65,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. The Egyptian pyramids were built roughly 4,500 years ago. Stonehenge reached its most complete form around 4,000 years ago. The entire sweep of what we call recorded history, everything in every textbook you ever read, every ancient civilization you were ever taught about, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Indus Valley, China, all of it together amounts to roughly 5,000 years. The people who first walked onto Australian soil did so 13 times that length of time ago. They arrived before the last ice age reached its deepest freeze. They arrived before the great megafauna extinctions reshaped continents. They arrived 65,000 years before the first written word, 63,000 years before the first known temple, and then they stayed. They did not collapse. They did not vanish into the archaeological record as a lost civilization. They built something. They built something across 65,000 years of continuous inhabitation that was more sophisticated, more ecologically complex, more architecturally inventive, and more linguistically diverse than almost anything that emerged anywhere else on Earth for most of that time. And then, in the space of roughly 150 years, a legal fiction was invented, a document was written, a policy was enforced, and the greatest continuous civilization in human history was officially declared to have never existed at all. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. This is that story. Not the story they put in the textbooks. Not the version that begins in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet and describes what came before as empty land and wandering nomads with no fixed address and no structure worth preserving. This is the version the evidence tells. And the evidence, once you actually look at it, is extraordinary. Start with the date itself. For a long time, the accepted timeline for Australian human arrival sat at around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago. That was already remarkable. That was already older than the cave paintings at Chauvet in France, older than the Venus figurines of Europe, older than virtually every other confirmed site of modern human habitation outside of Africa. But in 2017, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Nature that revised everything. They had been excavating a rock shelter in the Northern Territory called Majedbabe on Mirarr country, and what they found in the deepest occupation layers pushed the date of first arrival back to 65,000 years before the present. The tools they found were sophisticated. They were not crude stone flakes knocked off in desperation by people who barely knew what they were doing. They found ground edge axes, the oldest known ground edge axes on Earth. Anywhere. They found grinding stones used to process plant foods. They found reflective pigments that had been brought to the site from dozens of kilometers away, which means trade, which means planning, which means networks of communication and exchange that we have tended to associate with societies we consider advanced. All of this was happening 65,000 years ago in a rock shelter in northern Australia, while the ancestors of every European civilization were still in Africa, still tens of thousands of years away from setting foot on the continent where Rome would eventually be built. That fact alone should stop you. It stopped the researchers. It stopped the UNESCO committee. It should stop us now, and make us ask a question that somehow we rarely ask in the standard tellings of human history. If people arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago with ground-edge axes and trade networks and pigment use, what did 65,000 years of continuous habitation actually produce? What did those 65,000 years build? The answer begins with genetics, and it is strange in a way that science is still working through. The people who arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago carried something in their DNA that no other human population carries in the same form. They carried Denisovan ancestry. The Denisovans were a separate human species, cousins of the Neanderthals, known almost entirely from fragments of bone found in a cave in Siberia and from traces they left in the genomes of living people. Modern Aboriginal Australians carry the highest proportion of Denisovan ancestry of any human population on Earth. What this means is that the founders of Australian civilization did not just arrive from Africa and walk straight to Australia. They passed through regions where Denisovans lived and they interbred with them. They absorbed genetic material from a separate human lineage. They became, in a precise biological sense, something that had never existed before. A people who carried within their cells the combined inheritance of multiple human species, shaped then by 65,000 years of natural selection on a continent where the environment, the wildlife, the seasons, and the geological pressures were unlike anything their ancestors had faced before. This is not a metaphor. This is what the ancient DNA studies show. And it matters because it tells us that the people who built Australian civilization were not simply an offshoot of the same human population that built everything else. They were genuinely, measurably a different human product. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth was not a branch of the same tree as every other civilization. It was a different tree, grown from different soil, reaching in different directions, and lasting longer than any other. The next thing to understand is what the land looked like when they arrived, because it was not the land that exists today. 65,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are now. The shallow continental shelf around Australia was dry land. The continent that existed at that time was substantially larger. What is now the Bass Strait, the body of water separating mainland Australia from Tasmania, was a wide, flat, grassy plain. The Gulf of Carpentaria, the large indentation in Australia's northern coast, was a closed inland sea, still vast but not connected to the ocean. The northwest shelf extended out into what is now open ocean by hundreds of kilometers. The continent that the first Australians walked onto was called Sahul by the researchers who study it. It was a continent that had no name when they arrived because names are a human invention and they were the first humans to stand on it. It was a continent of extraordinary biological richness, megafauna that had evolved in the absence of human hunters. Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros. Procoptodon, a short-faced kangaroo that stood 2 meters tall and weighed 200 kilograms. Thylacoleo carnifex, a marsupial lion that was pound for pound one of the most powerful predators that has ever existed. And giant reptiles, monitor lizards 8 meters long, land crocodiles that could not have been crossed safely, a nightmare landscape of scaled giants that exist now only in fossil beds, and the stories that Aboriginal people have told about serpents large enough to reshape rivers. Those stories matter. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians are among the most rigorously studied examples of long-duration knowledge transmission on Earth. The work done by linguist Patrick Nunn and geographer Nicholas Reid, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2015 and following, demonstrated that Aboriginal oral traditions accurately describe geographical events that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. 7,000 to 12,000 years ago. These are stories that preserve accurate information about the flooding of the Bass Strait Plain, the inundation of coastal valleys, the submergence of river systems under rising seas as the last ice age ended and the global ocean climbed back to its current level. Nunn and Reid identified 21 separate Aboriginal oral traditions from different language groups across the continent, all describing the same geological event, all giving details that match the known scientific record of sea level rise at the end of the Pleistocene. The accuracy of these accounts over timescales of 7,000 to 12,000 years would be remarkable in any oral tradition in the world. In the context of Aboriginal Australian culture, it is not remarkable because it is entirely consistent with the broader pattern. This was a civilization built partly on the precise long-term transmission of knowledge across generations, without the need for a writing system, using a technology of memory and narrative and geography so sophisticated that it preserved geological facts with scientific accuracy across hundreds of generations. Think about what that means for the civilization itself. A culture that can transmit accurate geographical information across 7,000 years of oral tradition is not a culture stumbling through time with no structure. It is a culture with institutions. It is a culture with methods. It is a culture with the organizational capacity to ensure that what needs to be known is known by the people who need to know it, even when the people who originally knew it have been dead for 300 generations. The absence of stone tablets does not mean the absence of civilization. It means a different technology of knowledge preservation. And in some respects, the technology these people developed was more durable than anything written, because written records can be burned and libraries can be destroyed and languages can die. But knowledge embedded in living practice, in songs and ceremonies and the naming of places, is distributed across every member of a community in a way that cannot be erased by a single catastrophic event. It requires the destruction of the entire community, which is, as we will come to, exactly what was attempted. Before we get to the destruction, we need to understand what was built. And the most direct, undeniable, physically present evidence of what was built before Stonehenge, before Egypt, before any civilization that gets taught in schools, is the Brewarina fish traps in New South Wales. The Brewarina fish traps are a network of stone weirs, channels, and holding pools built across the Barwon River. They are constructed from millions of stones, fitted together with a precision that creates a system of interlocking traps that could channel fish from the river flow into holding pools where they could be kept alive and harvested as needed. The system spans more than 400 meters of the river. It is designed with an understanding of fluid dynamics, of seasonal flow patterns, of fish behavior, of the specific ecology of that particular stretch of river that could only have been developed through generations of close observation and iterative refinement. It is engineering, complex, purposeful hydraulic engineering. And based on the sediment evidence and the oral traditions associated with it, which describe its construction by the creator being Bayame in a time before time, the Brewarina fish traps are the oldest human-made structure on Earth, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than anything built in Mesopotamia. The oldest physical structure created by human hands anywhere on the planet may be sitting in a river in northern New South Wales. When European settlers arrived in the Brewarina region, they documented the fish traps. They wrote about them. They described them as extraordinary. Some of them were honest enough to acknowledge what they were looking at, which was evidence of a sophisticated food management system that supported large and stable communities in what the settlers had been told was empty land. And then, the colonial apparatus of resource extraction and land clearing and waterway alteration proceeded to partly destroy them. The Brewarina fish traps have been damaged by floods, made worse by upstream clearing, by alterations to river flow from irrigation infrastructure, by direct physical disturbance. What remains is still extraordinary. But what was there before the damage is something we can only partially reconstruct from the early European accounts and from the oral traditions of the Ngemba and Murawari peoples, whose ancestors built and maintained them for thousands of years. The Brewarina fish traps are not unique. They are the most well-documented example of a class of infrastructure that existed across the continent. In the Western District of Victoria, at a place called Bujbim, the Gunditjmara people built something that the academic world took a long time to recognize for what it was, And that recognition, when it finally came, changed the official story of Australian prehistory permanently. Budj Bim is a volcanic landscape created by eruptions that ended roughly 30,000 years ago. The Gunditjmara people, whose oral traditions describe witnessing these eruptions, which is itself a remarkable instance of knowledge preserved across 30,000 years, modified the natural lava flows to create an aquaculture system. They channeled water through constructed stone canals. They built stone weirs to control water levels. They created circular holding pools connected by channels that allowed eels to enter but made it difficult for them to leave. They built smoking platforms to preserve the eels for long-term storage and trade. The system they built at Budj Bim was not a simple fish trap. It was a managed food production system covering more than 40 square kilometers, capable of supporting a large, stable, and prosperous population in one place. The Budj Bim aquaculture system has been radiocarbon dated to at least 6,600 years before the present. 6,600 years ago. Stonehenge did not reach anything resembling its final form until roughly 4,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built roughly 4,500 years ago. The Gunditjmara people were building managed aquaculture infrastructure at Budj Bim more than 2,000 years before any of that. They were not nomads. They were not wandering across the landscape with no fixed address. They were living in permanent stone villages, harvesting a managed eel population from a constructed aquaculture system, smoking and trading surplus food with neighboring peoples, and they were doing all of this while the people who would eventually build Stonehenge were still, as far as we know, living in relatively simple foraging bands in northern Europe. In 2019, the Budj Bim cultural landscape was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It was the first Australian World Heritage Site to be inscribed exclusively for its Aboriginal cultural values. The inscription was, among other things, a formal acknowledgement by the international academic and heritage community that what the Gunditjmara people built was a civilization, not a proto-civilization, not a precursor to civilization, a civilization, full stop. But even Budj Bim, as extraordinary as it is only one node in a network that spanned the continent. To understand the scale of what existed before 1788, you have to understand the songlines. Not in the way they are usually described by people who have not spent time with the scholarly literature on them, not as a kind of mystical walkabout through a spiritually charged landscape, but in the technical sense of what they actually were and what they actually did. The songlines were a continental information infrastructure. They were a network of routes, each associated with a specific song sequence that mapped every significant geographical feature of the Australian continent. Water sources, food sources, astronomical markers, seasonal indicators, danger zones, meeting places, sacred sites, territorial boundaries. All of this information was encoded in song, and the song was learned in sections, with different sections held by different communities, so that a traveler moving along a song line could navigate by the song, knowing that when they reached the territory of the next community, the next section of the song would be taken up by people who knew their piece of the route. It was a distributed navigational database. A network protocol for sharing geographical information across a continent of more than 7.5 million square kilometers, maintained by hundreds of language groups, without any central authority and without any physical infrastructure beyond the land itself and the memories of the people who walked it. Anthropologist and writer Bruce Chatwin described the songlines as a kind of musical map of the continent. That is a useful starting point, but it undersells the technical achievement. The songlines were not simply maps. They were also legal documents, encoding rights and responsibilities associated with different sections of country. They were ecological databases, encoding knowledge about the behavior of plants and animals along specific routes at specific times of year. They were astronomical records, encoding knowledge of the stars and their seasonal positions as navigational aids. They were historical archives, encoding accounts of significant events associated with specific locations. All of this, layered into song, maintained by communities whose territories abutted each other along the route, cross-checked and corrected at regular gatherings, where different holders of different sections of the same song would perform their sections, and any errors in transmission would be identified and corrected by the group. It was peer review. It was distributed computing. It was a continental knowledge management system, running on human minds rather than silicon, and it had been running continuously for, at minimum, tens of thousands of years. The linguistic evidence supports the idea of a civilization of genuine complexity. When Europeans arrived in Australia, they encountered not a single language, but a landscape of more than 250 distinct languages, organized into language groups with shared grammatical structures suggesting deep common ancestry, but also thousands of years of divergent development. This level of linguistic diversity does not emerge from a simple foraging society wandering randomly across a landscape. It emerges from stable, long-established territorial communities, each with its own distinctive intellectual tradition, each maintaining its own body of knowledge about its own piece of country, and each participating in a broader network of exchange and communication with neighbouring groups. The linguistic diversity of Australia at the time of European contact was comparable to the linguistic diversity of Europe, but Australia had been inhabited for 65,000 years. Europe had been inhabited by modern humans for roughly 40,000 years. The linguistic landscape of Australia was the product of 65,000 years of human communities developing in place, in relationship with their country, refining their knowledge and their culture, and their institutional structures across a time span that dwarfs anything that happened anywhere else. The population that maintained all of this at the time of European contact has been a subject of considerable scholarly debate, but the most careful estimates place it somewhere between 750,000 and 1,200,000 people. Some scholars argue for higher figures. The lower figures were produced by colonial-era estimates that were, to put it plainly, motivated by the legal and political need to represent Australia as sparsely inhabited. The higher figures come from careful analysis of the carrying capacity of different regions, the density of documented settlements, and comparison with regions where early population estimates were later found to be dramatic undercounts. Whatever their precise figure, to Vidgers, a substantial population, not the handful of scattered wanderers that the legal fiction of terra nullius required it to be. A people, many peoples, hundreds of distinct peoples, each with their own language, their own territory, their own institutional structures, their own body of ecological knowledge, all participating in continental-scale networks of trade and ceremony and information exchange. A civilization, the oldest civilization on Earth. The physical evidence of that civilization is everywhere, if you know how to look for it. It is in the Earth itself. LiDAR surveys, which use laser pulses fired from aircraft to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain by stripping away the obscuring effect of vegetation, have begun to reveal, across large sections of the Australian landscape, patterns of landscape modification that are invisible at ground level and that were invisible from conventional aerial photography. These are the signatures of managed country, cleared areas, constructed channels, earthworks, arrangements of stone, fire management boundaries, the kinds of modifications that result not from random individual activity, but from organized, intentional, multi-generational work on the landscape. The continent that Europeans arrived on in 1788 was not a wild, unmodified natural landscape. It was a managed landscape. It had been managed for tens of thousands of years by people who understood it in a depth and a detail that no European naturalist of the 18th century could have matched. The grassy open woodlands that early settlers described as parkland, beautiful and inviting, were not natural. They were the product of systematic fire management, burning regimes carefully calibrated to encourage the growth of particular plants and to maintain the habitat of particular animals that had shaped the Australian landscape over millennia. When Aboriginal fire management practices were disrupted by the colonial process, the landscape changed. The open woodlands became denser and less productive. Fire accumulated in the understory without the regular low-intensity burns that had kept it in check. The great fires of the modern era, the catastrophic fires that shocked the world in the summer of 2019 and 2020, were partly a product of the erasure of the civilization that had managed Australia's fire ecology for 65,000 years. The evidence is in the burial sites. At Lake Mungo in the Willandra Lakes region of New South Wales, which is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Area, archaeologists in the 1960s and 1970s made discoveries that rewrote the timeline of human sophistication. In 1968, Jim Bowler discovered the cremated remains of a young woman, now known as Mungo Lady. She was approximately 42,000 years old, and she had been cremated. Her bones had been burned, then collected, then crushed, then buried in a specific location with evident ceremony. This is the oldest known example of cremation anywhere on Earth. 42,000 years ago, people at Lake Mungo were already practicing complex mortuary rituals that imply sophisticated beliefs about death, about identity, about what happens to a person after they die, and what obligations the living have toward the dead. Then, in 1974, Bowler found Mungo Man, also approximately 40,000 years old, and Mungo Man had been buried with ochre, the red pigment that appears at significant sites of ancient human activity all over the world. His body had been carefully prepared, he had been placed in a specific position. The burial was deliberate and ceremonially structured. Mungo Man is, as of current knowledge, the oldest known example of a ritual burial with ochre anywhere on the planet. 40,000 years ago, the people of Lake Mungo were participating in structured ceremonial life, in practices that required belief systems and community organization and the transmission of ritual knowledge across generations. They were not living at the edge of survival. They were living richly enough to have developed a sophisticated culture of death and memory. The Runka burial site on the Murray River in South Australia adds another dimension. Excavated in the 1960s and 1970s by Philip Clark and his team, Runka revealed a cemetery that had been in continuous use for approximately 10,000 years. A cemetery, a designated place for the burial of the dead, returned to generation after generation, containing the remains of people interred with personal ornaments, with grave goods, with a kind of deliberate attention to the individual that characterizes societies that maintain personal identity across death, that treat the end of a life as an event significant enough to mark with material culture. The Runka Cemetery contains burials spanning 10,000 years of continuous use. 10,000 years. The oldest parts of it were in use before Stonehenge existed, before the Egyptian dynasties began, before agriculture had reached most of Europe. The community that maintained Runka across 10,000 years was not a wandering band of nomads with no attachment to place. It was a community with a territory, with institutions, with a relationship to its dead that required and expressed a level of social organization that, if it were found anywhere else in the world, would be described without hesitation as civilizational. The Pilbara region of Western Australia contains the largest concentration of rock art in the world. At Murujuga, also known as the Burrup Peninsula, there are estimated to be more than 1 million individual rock engravings. 1 million. Pecked into the red granite surfaces of a landscape that was, before sea level rise, part of a larger coastal plain. The images include depictions of animals that are extinct, animals that disappeared from the Australian landscape tens of thousands of years ago. They include astronomical figures, they include human and humanoid forms, They include abstract geometric patterns that repeat across vast distances and across time periods spanning tens of thousands of years, suggesting continuous artistic and ceremonial traditions maintained over timescales that have no parallel anywhere in the world. The Murujuga rock art has been described as the largest outdoor art gallery on Earth. It predates every other surviving body of representational art anywhere in the world. And for most of the period since European colonization, it was threatened by the industrial development of the Burrup Peninsula for petrochemical processing plants, the exhaust gases from which were demonstrably damaging the rock surfaces and eroding engravings that had survived for tens of thousands of years. The question of what we choose to protect and what we choose to sacrifice tells us a great deal about what we believe to be valuable. And for a very long time, the choice made by the Australian state was to sacrifice the world's largest and oldest body of rock art in favour of petrochemical infrastructure. All of this, the aquaculture at Budj Bim, the fish traps at Broarina, the continental knowledge infrastructure of the songlines, the mortuary traditions at Lake Mungo and Runka, the rock art at Murujuga, the linguistic diversity of 250 languages, the ecological management of a continent through fire, the oral traditions that preserved accurate geological memory across 12,000 years, all of it was the product of a civilization, a real civilization, not a proto-civilization, not a precursor to civilization that would have eventually, given enough time, produced pyramids and writing systems and cities. A civilization in its own right, optimized for its own environment, built on its own intellectual and institutional foundations, running on its own principles, and lasting longer than any other civilization that has ever existed on Earth. And it was declared not to have existed at all. The mechanism of that declaration was the legal doctrine of terra nullius. The phrase is Latin and it means empty land. In the legal framework of European colonialism, territory could only be legitimately claimed by conquest, by treaty, or by occupation of land that belonged to no one. The British, when they claimed Australia in 1788, chose the third option. They declared that Australia was terra nullius, empty land, land belonging to no one, land with no sovereign inhabitants. Land that could be taken without conquest and without treaty because there was, legally speaking, no one there to conquer and no one with whom to make a treaty. This declaration was not made in ignorance. The First Fleet brought with them observers who described, in their letters and journals, the people they encountered. They described their settlements, they described their food management practices, they described their social organization. They described the clear territorial demarcations that existed between different groups. They were not looking at empty land. They were looking at inhabited land, managed land, civilized land, in the precise sense that the land bore the marks of long-term human occupation and management. And they declared it empty anyway, because the legal and economic interests of the British colonial project required it to be empty, and declaring it empty was within their power. The people who were already there could not stop it. Not with the technological disparity that existed between a society that had developed in isolation from iron and gunpowder and one that had spent the previous several centuries industrializing the application of both. Terra nullius was not simply a legal declaration, it was an ideological program. It required the active management of the evidence, and the evidence was abundant, and to anyone who looked at it carefully, impossible to reconcile with the claim that Australia was empty and its inhabitants were without civilization. The response to this problem was not to revise the legal claim. The response was to construct an intellectual framework that would allow the evidence to be acknowledged while still denying its significance. That framework was the theory of the primitive. Aboriginal Australians, according to this framework, were not civilized because they did not have cities and did not have writing and did not have the specific material technologies that European civilization had produced. The fish traps at Brewarrina were acknowledged to exist, but described as simple, as natural, as instinctive rather than engineered. The aquaculture system at Buj Bim was visible to anyone who walked through the landscape, but was not recognized as aquaculture for nearly a century after European settlement of the region, because the intellectual framework available to the settlers could not accommodate the idea that people without iron tools had built a managed food production system covering 40 square kilometers. The songlines were dismissed as superstition. The ecological knowledge was dismissed as luck. The 250 languages were treated as dialects of a single primitive communication system, rather than as evidence of the same kind of civilizational complexity that the diversity of European languages would have been taken to. Represent. This was not a passive intellectual failure, it was an active intellectual project, serving specific political and economic ends. The land could not be taken if the people who lived on it were recognized as a civilization. So the people who lived on it could not be recognized as a civilization. The intellectual infrastructure of colonial anthropology was built to ensure that they would not be. Edward Tyler, Lewis Henry Morgan, the founders of the academic discipline of anthropology in the 19th century, constructed evolutionary hierarchies of human societies in which Aboriginal Australians were placed at the bottom as examples of the earliest and most primitive stage of human development, useful to science precisely as living specimens of what all human societies had once been before the development of civilization. This framework was not science. It was ideology dressed in the language of science. It served the interests of the colonial project, and it did so effectively, because it provided an intellectual justification for dispossession that appeared to be grounded in objective scholarship, rather than in the naked exercise of power. The physical destruction proceeded alongside the intellectual erasure. The colonial frontier in Australia was not, as it has sometimes been presented, a simple matter of settlement and peaceful coexistence interrupted by occasional conflict. It was a sustained campaign of dispossession and violence that reduced the Aboriginal population from something between 750,000 and 1,200,000 people at the time of European contact to approximately 31,000 people by the time the first national census was taken in 1901. Let those numbers sit together. In the space of approximately 113 years, the population of a civilization that had existed for 65,000 years was reduced by approximately 97%. In some regions, the reduction was effectively complete. Languages that had been spoken for tens of thousands of years fell silent because the last people who knew them were dead. Knowledge systems that had encoded ecological information accumulated across millennia died with the practitioners who held them. Ceremonial traditions that had been maintained across hundreds of generations were disrupted and destroyed. The infrastructure of the songlines, which required living communities in continuous relationship with their country to maintain it, was shattered in region after region as communities were killed, displaced, concentrated on missions and reserves, and separated from the landscapes their knowledge described. This was not an accident. It was not simply the unfortunate byproduct of an otherwise benevolent process of settlement. It was a predictable and in many cases intended consequence of specific policies and specific acts of violence carried out over more than a century, with the active support of colonial governments and the tacit approval of a metropolitan public that had been provided with an intellectual framework assuring them that what was being lost was not civilization but primitiveness, not achievement but the absence of achievement, not a world but an empty land. Terra nullius was not just a legal doctrine, it was a way of seeing. And that way of seeing has consequences that extend far beyond the legal and the historical. It shapes what we teach in schools. It shapes what we include in the timeline of human achievement. It shapes what we put in textbooks and what we leave out, and one of the things it leaves out is the oldest civilization on Earth. The scientific community has, in recent decades, been reconstructing what was lost or hidden or misrepresented. The 2017 revision of the Australian arrival date to 65,000 years is one part of that reconstruction. The UNESCO World Heritage inscription of Budj Bim in 2019 is another. The collaborative research between scientists and Aboriginal communities that has produced studies like the Nun and Reed work on oral traditions preserving geological memory is another. The growing body of archaeogenetic research that has traced the deep history of the Australian population and confirmed both its extraordinary antiquity and its extraordinary genetic complexity is another. Slowly, imperfectly, with many gaps still remaining where knowledge was destroyed and cannot be fully recovered, the picture of what actually existed in Australia before 1788 is being reconstructed. And the picture that is emerging is not of a primitive people living outside of history. It is of a sophisticated civilization, the oldest and longest-lasting civilization on Earth, that was systematically erased by a combination of legal fiction, intellectual ideology, and sustained violence over the course of a century and a half. The question that the evidence forces us to ask is not simply historical. It is not only a question about what happened in the past. It is a question about what we are willing to see. The evidence has been available in various forms for a very long time. The fish traps at Brewarrina were documented by early settlers. The burial sites at Lake Mungo were excavated and published in the 1960s and 1970s. The aquaculture at Budj Bim was visible to anyone who walked through that volcanic landscape and looked at the stone channels and weirs with anything like careful attention. The oral traditions were recorded by anthropologists and missionaries who wrote them down and stored them in archives and libraries. The evidence has been there. What has been missing is the willingness to read it as evidence of civilization rather than evidence of primitiveness. That willingness has been slow to develop because the intellectual framework built by colonial anthropology in the 19th century is still, in many ways, structuring the assumptions with which we approach the human past. The category of primitive is deeply embedded in how we think about human development. It is the category we use when we want to explain why a society that existed for 65,000 years and built the world's oldest aquaculture system and the world's oldest cremation practices and a continental information infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication does not appear in the timeline of human achievement. We say they were primitive, they were at an early stage of development, they had not yet reached civilization. And in saying that, we are not describing reality. We are perpetuating a fiction that was invented to justify a theft. The fiction begins to unravel when you look at the specific sites and the specific evidence in detail. And the detail is where the real story lives, because it is in the particulars that the scale of the civilizational achievement becomes undeniable. Let us go back to Lake Mungo, because what happened there in the 1960s and 1970s deserves more attention than it usually receives in the standard tellings. And what has happened there since deserves even more. The Willandra Lakes region in far southwestern New South Wales is a place that feels like the edge of the world. It is flat, red, and searingly hot in summer. The landscape has the quality of immense geological time visible in its bones. The pale clay lunettes that curve along the eastern shores of the dry lake beds. The exposed layers of sediment that contain, if you know how to read them, a record of climate and ecology and human occupation going back more than 50,000 years. It is a place where the sediment has been slowly eroding for decades, and where the eroding sediment periodically exposes things that have been buried for a very long time. Jim Bowler was a geomorphologist, a scientist who studies landforms, and he was working in the Willandra Lakes region in the late 1960s, studying the sedimentary record of past climates, when he noticed something unusual eroding from the lunette at Lake Mungo. What he noticed turned out to be the cremated and reburied remains of a young woman who had been dead for approximately 42,000 years. He had found Mungo Lady, and Mungo Lady changed everything, or should have. The significance of the find was not simply the age, although the age was extraordinary. The significance was what the burial revealed about the people who performed it, Cremation is not a simple or an instinctive response to death. It requires the construction of a fire hot enough and sustained enough to reduce a human body to ash and fragments of calcined bone. It requires the decision to gather those fragments after the fire. It requires the decision to further process them, to crush them, possibly to mix them with something, and then to inter them in a specific location with evident intention. None of this is accidental. None of this is the behavior of a people living at the edge of survival, with no intellectual or cultural space for anything beyond the immediate demands of subsistence. Cremation is a cultural choice. It is a ritual technology. It implies beliefs about the nature of the person, about the relationship between the material body and whatever is understood to persist after death, about the appropriate way to mark the transition between life and death. It implies communication of those beliefs across generations. It implies the teaching of the practice to those who will need to perform it in the future. It is, in short, a product of civilization. Mungo Lady was not an isolated find. In the decades that followed her discovery, the Willandra Lakes region yielded more than 107 sets of human remains from the Pleistocene era, many of them showing evidence of ceremonial treatment. The people who left these remains behind were not a small isolated band living in a marginal environment. The Willandra Lakes at the time of occupation, during the wet phase of the last glacial period, was a system of large, productive freshwater lakes connected by channels and supporting rich fish populations, dense stands of edible plants, and abundant wildlife. It was an ideal environment for a substantial and prosperous community. The archaeological evidence suggests that the people who lived there were not simply exploiting that environment opportunistically. They were managing it. They were harvesting fish with nets, the evidence of which appears in the form of thousands of fish bones representing consistent patterns of selective harvest. They were gathering and processing a wide range of plant foods. They were producing ochre for ceremonial use, bringing it to the site from distant sources. They were burying their dead in a designated location with consistent ceremonial practice over a period of tens of thousands of years. Mungo Man, found in 1974, added another dimension. His remains were approximately 40,000 years old. He had been buried in a specific posture. His body had been dusted with red ochre, and in his remains, genetic researchers in the late 1990s found something that set off one of the most intense controversies in the history of Australian archaeology. The DNA extracted from Mungo Man's mitochondrial genome, the genetic material inherited through the maternal line, did not match the mitochondrial DNA of any living human population. It fell outside the known human mitochondrial phylogenetic tree. The researchers who conducted the analysis, led by Greg Adcock, published their findings in 2001, arguing that Mungo Man represented a branch of the human lineage that had no living descendants, and that modern Aboriginal Australians were descended from a separate, later migration. The implications were extraordinary. If Mungo Man was genetically distinct from all living humans, including all living Aboriginal Australians, it suggested that the human story in Australia was far more complex than a single founding migration. It suggested multiple migrations, or multiple populations, possibly including populations that left no genetic descendants in the modern world. The controversy that followed was fierce. Many researchers disputed the DNA analysis, arguing that the ancient DNA was too degraded and contaminated to yield reliable results. Others argued that the findings were genuine and needed to be taken seriously. The debate has not been fully resolved. What it has made clear is that the human history of Australia is more complex, more ancient, and more internally diverse than the simple narrative of a single founding migration would suggest. The ancient DNA question is directly connected to one of the most significant findings in human genetics of the past decade. The Denisovan ancestry of Aboriginal Australians, which we mentioned in the context of the arrival story, has continued to yield unexpected complexity as researchers have analysed it in more detail. The Denisovans, known from fragments of bone from a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, turn out to have been not one population but several. There appear to have been multiple, distinct Denisovan populations, distributed across a vast geographical range from Siberia to Southeast Asia. Modern Aboriginal Australians carry ancestry that traces to at least two distinct Denisovan populations, meaning that the people who founded Australian civilization interbred with Denisovans at least twice, in different locations, at different times, during their journey from Africa. This level of genetic complexity, the combination of ancient African ancestry with Denisovan admixture from at least two separate populations, plus the extremely long subsequent period of in situ evolution in Australia, has produced a human genetic profile that is genuinely unique. The people of Aboriginal Australia are not simply an ancient offshoot of the same lineage as everyone else. They are, in the most precise possible sense, a product of the deepest and most complex human genetic history of anyone alive today. They are not more primitive, they are more ancient. And ancient, in genetics as in archaeology, means more differentiated, more specifically adapted, more deeply shaped by the specific pressures of the specific environment in which they evolved. When we dismiss Aboriginal Australians as primitive, we are literally inverting the truth. They are the most anciently human of any living people. Understanding this genetic depth helps explain something that is otherwise difficult to account for: the extraordinary ecological knowledge that Aboriginal communities possess and that has been consistently underestimated and undervalued by the scientific and governmental institutions that have interacted with those communities since 1788. This is not simply a matter of accumulated observation, although it is certainly that. It is also a matter of selection. Over 65,000 years, the people who were best at reading the Australian landscape, who best understood its plants and animals and water systems and fire regimes and seasonal patterns, were more likely to survive and to pass on both their genes and their knowledge. Ecological knowledge was not peripheral to survival in Australia. It was survival. And 65,000 years of selection pressure for ecological competence produced a human culture in which ecological knowledge was extraordinarily detailed, extraordinarily precise, and extraordinarily well organized. Modern ethnobotanical studies of Aboriginal knowledge systems have consistently found that Aboriginal communities possess information about the plant species of their territories that is more detailed and more accurate than the corresponding scientific literature. Studies of Aboriginal fire management practices have found that the outcomes produced by traditional burning regimes are, in terms of ecological health indicators, significantly better than the outcomes produced by modern fire management policies. This is not romanticization. This is the measurable result of 65,000 years of applied ecological science, maintained by a civilization with a stake in the long-term productivity of its landscape. The fire management dimension of Aboriginal civilization deserves particular attention because it is one of the most visible and most extensively documented examples of civilizational-scale landscape engineering. The practice of controlled burning to manage the Australian landscape is ancient. Charcoal records from lake sediment cores across the continent show patterns of burning that predate European arrival by tens of thousands of years and that are consistent with deliberate, systematic fire management rather than random natural fire events. The patterns show a landscape that was regularly burned in a mosaic pattern, with different patches of country burned at different times, creating a patchwork of habitats at different stages of post-fire regeneration that maximize the productivity and the biodiversity of the landscape as a whole. Different species of animals concentrate in different post-fire habitats. Some prefer the dense regrowth of recent burns, others prefer the more open conditions of areas that have not burned for some years. By maintaining a mosaic of post-fire habitats, Aboriginal fire managers maximize the total number of animals in a given area and maximize their predictability because the locations of different animal species at different times of year could be read from the fire history of the landscape. The landscape itself became a managed system, a kind of open-air farm that did not require the same kind of fixed boundaries and intensive labor as agricultural cultivation, but that was no less the product of human ingenuity and human management. Bill Gammage, in his book The Biggest Estate on Earth, published in 2011, argued that Australia in 1788 was not a natural landscape, but a managed estate, shaped by Aboriginal fire management to a degree, and with a sophistication that Europeans failed to recognize because they were looking for the wrong kind of management. They were looking for fences and fields. What they found was something more subtle and, in terms of long-term ecological sustainability, are more impressive. The trade networks that connected Aboriginal communities across the continent are another dimension of the civilizational picture that is rarely taught in schools. The popular image of Aboriginal communities as isolated, self-sufficient, and bounded by their own territories is simply inaccurate. The archaeological and ethnographic record shows extensive long-distance trade in a wide range of goods, including stone tools and the raw materials for making them, ochre, decorative shells, edible products, and objects of ceremonial significance. Pearl shell ornaments from the northwest coast of Western Australia have been found at archaeological sites more than 3,000 kilometres away in the interior and southeast of the continent. Baler shells from the Queensland coast appear in sites in the Northern Territory and South Australia. The green stone used to make the Mount William stone axes, quarried at a specific site in Victoria, was traded across thousands of kilometres of the southeastern Australian declicrate. The raw materials used to make the tools found at Medjedba Bay 65,000 years ago in the Northern Territory included pigments and stones that had been brought from dozens of kilometres away, suggesting that trade networks of some kind are as old as the human occupation of the continent itself. These are not the trade networks of a simple subsistence society. These are the trade networks of a civilization, connecting distant communities through relationships of exchange that required trust, communication, shared protocols, and the kind of surplus production that allows you to produce more than you immediately need and use the surplus to acquire things from elsewhere. The ceremonial gatherings that punctuated the Aboriginal calendar were another dimension of civilizational complexity. These were not simply social events. They were the occasions at which the diverse and distributed institutions of Aboriginal civilization were exercised and renewed. At the large gatherings, which brought together hundreds or sometimes thousands of people from different communities, the songlines were sung in their full extent, with different sections performed by the communities responsible for them, checked against each other for accuracy, and updated where needed. Law was adjudicated. Disputes that had arisen between communities during the year were brought before assembled elders and resolved through processes of negotiation and arbitration. Trade goods accumulated through the year were exchanged. Young people from different communities met each other and formed the social connections that would eventually lead to marriages, to the movement of individuals between communities, and to the maintenance of the genetic exchange that prevented the inbreeding that would have threatened the health of small isolated populations. Knowledge was exchanged. New observations, new techniques, new understanding of particular aspects of the natural world were shared, and ceremony was performed. The great ceremonial traditions that renewed the relationship between the human community and the country it occupied, that affirmed the obligations and rights encoded in the songlines, that marked the transitions between life stages and the turning of the seasons and the movements of the astronomical bodies that structured the calendar. These gatherings have been documented by anthropologists, by early missionaries and settlers who happened to witness them, and by the oral traditions of the communities that participated in them. What the documentation reveals is not a simple tribal festival. It is something more like a parliament and a university and a trade fair and a judicial court, all operating simultaneously in a single extended gathering. The scale of the largest gatherings, which assembled people from across vast territories and sustained complex ceremonial performances over days and weeks, required organizational capacity, logistical planning, the management of food and water resources sufficient to support large numbers of people in one place for extended periods, and the maintenance of the social protocols that allowed people from different communities and different language groups to interact without conflict. This is not the behavior of a people without institutions. It is the behavior of a people with sophisticated institutions, operating at a scale appropriate to the continent they inhabited and the civilizational traditions they had developed over 65,000 years. The astronomical knowledge encoded in those traditions is a dimension of Aboriginal civilization that has received growing scholarly attention in recent decades. The field of cultural astronomy, which studies the astronomical knowledge systems of different cultures, has documented sophisticated Aboriginal astronomical traditions from communities across the continent. These traditions include detailed knowledge of the movements of the sun and moon and the visible planets, knowledge of the seasonal positions of stars and constellations, and the use of those positions to structure the calendar, and knowledge of phenomena like meteor showers, comets, and eclipses. The dark cloud constellations of Aboriginal astronomy, in which constellations are defined not by patterns of stars but by the dark patches in the Milky Way caused by interstellar dust clouds, are a distinctive astronomical tradition that has no parallel in European astronomy. The emu in the sky, visible as a dark cloud pattern that stretches along the Milky Way, rises in the appropriate position for emu nesting in spring. Aboriginal communities use this astronomical signal to time their harvesting of emu eggs. This is applied ecology encoded in astronomy. It is a knowledge system that integrates the study of the sky with the management of food resources in a way that is elegant, practical, and entirely alien to the European astronomical tradition that was established without reference to it. The stone arrangements found across the Australian landscape are another form of evidence that has been under-examined and undervalued. There are hundreds of documented stone arrangements in Australia, ranging from small groupings of a few stones to large and elaborate constructions involving thousands of stones arranged in specific patterns. Some of these arrangements have been dated, where datable material is associated with them. Others can only be estimated in age from their association with other features of the landscape. The Wurdi Yuang stone arrangement near Geelong in Victoria is one of the most studied. It is a large oval arrangement of stones, with outlier stones that align with the setting sun at the solstices and equinoxes. Duane Hamaka, an astrophysicist who has made the study of Aboriginal astronomical traditions his life's work, has argued that Wurdi Yuang may represent evidence of a systematic interest in solar astronomy, the kind of interest in the precise measurement of the sun's annual cycle that in other parts of the world produced monuments like Stonehenge and the solar alignments at Newgrange. The Wurdi Yuang arrangement has been argued by some researchers to be more than 10,000 years old, which would make it older than Stonehenge by several thousand years. The dating is contested, but the astronomical alignment is not contested. The stones point where they point. The question is what the people who arranged them were trying to do, and the most economical answer is that they were tracking the sun's annual cycle, just as people in other parts of the world were doing, but earlier and with a different material technology. The Carrawine Gorge in the Pilbara region of Western Australia contains rock art that, like the broader Murujuga collection, pushes the timeline of Australian artistic tradition further back than almost anything else that has been identified anywhere on Earth. The engravings include images that have been argued to depict Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion that went extinct in Australia more than 46,000 years ago. If that identification is correct, then some of the Pilbara rock art was made before the last ice age, before the megafauna extinctions, before the flooding of the coastal plains by rising sea levels. It was made by people who were contemporaries of a world that is now entirely gone. a world of giant wombats and marsupial lions and 3-meter-tall kangaroos, and they left a record of that world on the surfaces of rocks that have preserved it for tens of thousands of years. This is not the behavior of a people living outside of history. This is the behavior of a people making history, recording their experience of the world for reasons that mattered to them, whether those reasons were spiritual or commemorative or educational or some combination of all of those things. The cow swamp remains, found in the riverine region of northern Victoria, added a further layer of complexity to the picture and a further layer of political controversy to the management of that complexity. The cow swamp collection consists of more than 40 sets of human skeletal remains, most of them dated to between 9,500 and 13,500 years ago. The remains showed a physical robustness that surprised and in some cases disturbed the researchers who studied them. The skulls were thicker, with more pronounced brow ridges and more sloping foreheads than the skulls of modern Aboriginal Australians or of contemporary populations anywhere else in the world. Some researchers interpreted this as evidence of a population with archaic anatomical features that had persisted in Australia long after such features had disappeared elsewhere. Others argued for interbreeding with archaic human populations. Still others argued that the apparent anatomical differences were the product of deliberate artificial cranial modification, the practice of binding or otherwise reshaping the heads of infants to produce specific skull shapes, a practice documented in many cultures around the world. Whatever the correct explanation, the cow swamp remains revealed that the human population of Australia 13,000 years ago was not biologically homogeneous, and that the biological history of the continent is more complex than the story of a single founding migration with no subsequent diversification would suggest. The controversy over the cow swamp remains became politically charged in the 1980s and 1990s, when Aboriginal communities began asserting their rights to the repatriation of ancestral remains from museums and research institutions. The cow swamp collection was held in the Museum Victoria. The Yorta Yorta people, the traditional owners of the cow swamp region, requested the repatriation of the remains. Scientists argued that the remains were of enormous scientific value and that their repatriation would result in the loss of irreplaceable research material. The Yorta Yorta argued that the remains were their ancestors and that the scientific analysis of those ancestors without community consent was a continuation of the colonial practice of treating Aboriginal people as objects of study rather than as human beings with rights and agency. This argument is, from a straightforward ethical standpoint, correct. The history of how those remains came to be in museum collections in the first place is not a history of consensual scientific collection. It is a history of grave robbing, of the collection of remains from massacre sites, of the exhumation of recently buried individuals without family or community consent. The scientific value of the remains does not retroactively justify the means by which they were obtained, and the Yorta Yorta people's claim to the remains was ultimately recognized. The cow swamp collection was repatriated and reburied. The repatriation debate is important not simply as a story about the ethics of museum collections. It is important as a story about the broader question of who owns the past and who gets to decide how the past is interpreted and represented. For most of the period since 1788, the answer to that question in Australia has been the descendants of the people who arrived in 1788. The Aboriginal past was the subject of study, not a subject with a voice in how that study was conducted or how its findings were used. This is beginning to change. The collaborative research model, in which Aboriginal communities are partners in the investigation of their own history, rather than simply the subjects of that investigation, is producing research that is both scientifically stronger and ethically sounder than the extractive model it is replacing. The work at Majidbebe that produced the 65,000-year date was conducted in partnership with the Mirarr people, the traditional owners of the land on which the site sits. The Mirarr were consulted at every stage. Their knowledge of the site was incorporated into the research design. Their consent was required before the excavation could proceed. The result was not just a more ethical research process. It was a better science, because the traditional knowledge held by the Mirarr community included information about the site that the researchers would not otherwise have had access to. The concept of country, which is central to Aboriginal Australian worldviews, and which is often misunderstood or sentimentalized in non-Aboriginal accounts of those worldviews, is directly relevant to understanding the civilizational achievement of Aboriginal Australia. Country, in the Aboriginal sense, is not simply territory. It is not simply the land that a community lives on and draws resources from. Country is a relationship. It is the complex web of responsibilities and entitlements that connect a community to a specific piece of land and to everything in that land: the plants, the animals, the water systems, the geological formations, the sky above it, and the ancestral beings whose actions in the deep past created the features of the landscape and established the laws governing human behavior within it. A community's knowledge of its country is not background information. It is the primary intellectual achievement of that community, the accumulated product of generations of observation, understanding, and relationship building that constitutes the community's most important inheritance from its ancestors and its most important gift to its descendants. This concept of country explains why the dispossession of Aboriginal communities from their territories was not simply a matter of economic deprivation or political disempowerment, though it was certainly both of those things. It was a civilizational catastrophe. When a community was removed from its country, it was not simply being moved from one place to another. It was being severed from the primary context in which its knowledge made sense. The ecological knowledge held by a community about its country, the fire management techniques, the water management practices, the knowledge of plant and animal behavior at specific locations and specific times of year was knowledge about that specific country. It was not abstract or transferable. It was embedded in the landscape, in the specific features and species and patterns of that specific place. Remove the community from the country, and you do not simply displace it. You destroy the context in which its knowledge is functional, and you begin the process by which that knowledge, without the daily practice and daily reinforcement that its country would have provided, begins to degrade. The disruption of the relationship between Aboriginal communities and their countries was not an unintended consequence of the colonial process. It was, in many cases, its deliberate mechanism, because a community separated from its country loses the practical basis for its cultural and intellectual autonomy, and a community that has lost its cultural and intellectual autonomy is much easier to absorb and control. The frontier violence that drove dispossession across the continent is a history that Australia has been, very slowly, coming to terms with. The frontier wars, as historians have begun to call the sustained conflict between Aboriginal people and colonial settlers and police that continued from the late 18th century through to the early 20th century, are among the most extensive and least documented episodes of colonial violence in the history of European expansion. They have been called the most secret violence in Australian history, hidden not simply because they occurred in remote places and in a period before comprehensive documentary record-keeping, but because there was a systematic effort, at the level of both official policy and personal interest, to keep them out of the record. The colonial governors and the colonial press and the colonial administrative apparatus generally did not want the details of frontier violence to be known because the details were inconsistent with the legal and moral framework within which the colonial project was justified. Terra nullius could not coexist with the documentary record of organized and sustained military campaigns against the people who occupied the supposedly empty land, so the campaigns were not recorded as campaigns. They were described, when they were described at all, as inevitable conflicts between civilization and savagery, as police actions against criminal elements, as unfortunate necessities in the difficult work of settlement, The language of civilization and savagery was itself a political technology deployed to make the systematic destruction of a civilization appear as its opposite. The Mile Creek Massacre of 1838, in which a group of stockmen killed at least 28 Werere people in New South Wales, including women and children, became historically significant, not because it was unusual, but because it was one of the very few frontier killings for which the perpetrators were tried, convicted, and executed. The trial produced outrage among the settler community, not because the killing was seen as wrong, but because the conviction was seen as a dangerous precedent. Settlers wrote letters to newspapers arguing that holding white men accountable for the killing of Aboriginal people would undermine the stability of the colonial enterprise. The explicit argument was that the rule of law, applied equally to Aboriginal people and Europeans, was incompatible with the colonial project. This argument was, in the long run, largely successful. The Mile Creek convictions remained exceptional. The frontier violence continued, largely without legal consequence for the perpetrators, for another 80 years. The protection policies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries added a bureaucratic dimension to the physical violence of the frontier era. Under these policies, which were administered by state governments through boards of Aboriginal protection, Aboriginal people were subject to a system of surveillance, control, and forced separation that regulated nearly every aspect of their lives. They were confined to reserves. They required permission to leave reserves. Their wages, when they received wages, were held in trust by the protection boards and frequently never actually paid to them. Children were removed from their families and placed in institutions or with non-Aboriginal families, where they were prevented from speaking their languages and practicing their cultures and learning the knowledge systems of their communities. These children, and the generations that followed them, are known today as the stolen generations. The removal of children from their families continued in Australia until the 1970s. The institutional and personal consequences of that removal are still visible and still causing harm in Aboriginal communities today, in the form of elevated rates of mental illness, substance abuse, family violence, and all the other markers of communities that have been systematically traumatized and then systematically blamed for the consequences of that trauma. The protection policies were not designed to protect Aboriginal people. They were designed by their architects to manage what was described as the inevitable extinction of the Aboriginal population, to smooth the dying away of a people who were assumed to have no viable future in the modern world, and in the meantime to extract whatever economic value could be extracted from their labor. The language of protection was a euphemism for a system of control that was designed and administered with a specific political purpose: to complete, through bureaucratic means, the process of civilizational erasure that the frontier violence had begun but not quite finished. The survival of Aboriginal civilization in the face of all of this, the fact that there are today more than 800,000 people who identify as Aboriginal Australians, that more than 100 Aboriginal languages are still spoken, that traditional knowledge systems are still held and still practiced in communities across the continent, that the connections to country have survived even the enforced separations of the protection era is not a minor miracle. It is an extraordinary testament to the resilience of the institutions that sustained that civilization for 65,000 years. The songlines were not fully destroyed because the knowledge they encode, while it was disrupted in many regions, was never fully separated from the people who held it. Languages survived because they were spoken in secret, in the homes and communities of people who had been instructed that speaking them was forbidden and who spoke them anyway. Ceremonial traditions survived because they were maintained in forms that were invisible to the colonial administration, performed in spaces and at times that the administrators did not know about and could not monitor. Traditional ecological knowledge survived because it was embedded in practices that continued even when the formal ceremonial context that had originally structured those practices was disrupted. The The survival was not complete. No one should pretend otherwise. The losses are real and they are enormous. Languages that will never be spoken again. Knowledge systems that died with the last people who held them. Ceremonial traditions that cannot be reconstructed because the people who performed them are gone, and the recordings that were made of them, when any were made at all, are insufficient to support reconstruction. The destruction was real, the loss is real, but so is the survival. And the survival tells us something important about the nature of the civilization that produced it. A civilization that survived 65,000 years of geological change, of climatic shifts, of sea level rise that drowned its coastal territories, of the arrival of a foreign power that declared it non-existent and then did its best to make that declaration true, is not a fragile or a primitive thing. It is the most durable human institution that has ever existed. The recovery of the true story of that institution, the replacement of the colonial mythology with something closer to the reality, is a project that is still very much in progress. The Mabo decision of 1992, in which the High Court of Australia ruled that terra nullius had never validly applied to Australia, because Australia had always been inhabited by people with their own legal relationships to their land, was a crucial legal step. The recognition of native title that followed opened, however imperfectly and however slowly, a pathway for Aboriginal communities to assert their relationships to their countries within the legal system of the Australian state. The formal apology delivered by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008 to the stolen generations was a public acknowledgement that the policies of child removal were wrong and caused harm, though it was followed by significant disappointment when the material consequences of that acknowledgement proved limited. The Voice referendum of 2023 was a more recent episode in the ongoing negotiation between the Australian state and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who are its oldest inhabitants, a negotiation whose outcome will continue to shape the relationship between the oldest civilization on Earth and the political structures that were imposed on top of it in 1788. But the deepest recovery is happening not in the courts and not in the parliament, but in the land itself, in the research sites where scientists and Aboriginal communities are working together to reconstruct what was built and what was lost, in the classrooms where young people are beginning to learn a history of Australia that includes 65,000 years rather than just 236, in the communities where languages are being taught to a new generation and traditional knowledge is being documented before the last holders of it are gone. It is happening in the fire country of Victoria, where traditional burning is being reintroduced to landscapes that have been ecologically degraded by its absence, and where the results are demonstrably and measurably better than what modern fire management has achieved. It is happening at Budj-Bim, where the Gunditjmara people are managing their World Heritage landscape with the knowledge systems that built it, and where the recognition of that knowledge system as a genuine civilizational achievement by the international heritage community has changed what it means for the Gunditjmara and for the world to know that this aquaculture system existed 6,600 years ago. It is happening in the genomics laboratories, where ancient DNA is being extracted from remains with the consent and involvement of the communities whose ancestors those remains belong to, and where the story being told by that DNA is the story of the deepest and most complex human genetic history on Earth. What that recovery reveals, incrementally and incompletely, but with growing clarity, is a civilization of extraordinary scope and depth. Not a civilization that was waiting to become something else. Not a civilization that was at a primitive stage of development that it would eventually have grown out of. A civilization that was, within its own terms, complete. That had developed its own answers to the fundamental questions that all civilizations must answer. How do you manage a landscape across time? Through systematic fire and the songlines and the deep ecological knowledge encoded in 250 languages. How do you transmit knowledge across generations? through ceremony and song and the institutions of country and the great gatherings where knowledge is checked and renewed. How do you maintain social order across a continent with no central government? Through the distributed legal system encoded in the songlines, through the institutions of kinship and marriage that connected communities across vast distances, through the ceremonial economy that created obligations of exchange and reciprocity between communities that might be thousands of kilometers apart. How do you feed a population sustainably across tens of thousands of years? Through the managed landscape of fire and aquaculture and the fish traps and the knowledge of seasonal abundance embedded in the astronomical calendar? How do you mark the passage of time and the significance of events? Through the rock art and the burial traditions and the oral histories that preserved accurate memory of geological events that occurred 12,000 years ago. All of these are answers. They are good answers. They sustained a civilization for 65,000 years on the driest inhabited continent on Earth, across one of the most challenging and variable environments that human beings have ever occupied. And they were systematically dismissed and destroyed by a colonial project that arrived in 1788 with a legal document declaring the land empty and the intellectual conviction that the people it found there were too primitive to count. The evidence says otherwise. The evidence says that what was here before 1788, what was here before Stonehenge, what was here before the pyramids, before writing, before every civilization that the textbooks describe as the foundation of the modern world, was something remarkable. Something that deserves to be recognized not simply as the predecessor to what came after, but as a civilizational achievement in its own right. The oldest, the most durable, the most ecologically sophisticated. A civilization built on a different understanding of what civilization is, what it requires, what it produces, and how long it can last when it is built correctly. It lasted 65,000 years. Nothing else has come close. And it is still here. Diminished, damaged, fighting for recognition and restoration, but here. The oldest civilization on Earth is not gone. It survived. And the story of how it survived is as extraordinary as the story of what it built. When the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay in January of 1788, the people who stood on the shore and watched the ship's anchor were not looking at the future with fear. They were looking at it with curiosity. The accounts of the first encounters, written by members of the British expedition, describe Aboriginal people approaching the ships without the kind of terror that might be expected from people confronting, for the first time, objects and a technology entirely outside their experience. They approached carefully, but they approached. They attempted communication. They were curious. This makes sense, because a people with 65,000 years of accumulated experience, navigating an enormous and complex continent, adapting to major climatic shifts, developing new technologies in response to new challenges, would approach a novel situation with the intellectual tools that their civilization had given them. They would attempt to understand it, to communicate with it, to find the human logic in it. What they could not have anticipated was that the system of logic the newcomers were operating within had already, before the ships dropped anchor, classified them as not fully human, as inhabiting a land that was legally empty, as a people who could be dispossessed without treaty or compensation because they had no legal standing in the framework of property and sovereignty that the newcomers brought with them. The confrontation between those two systems of logic, between the 65,000-year-old civilization that had built the world's first aquaculture, that had encoded geological memory and song across 12,000 years, that had navigated a continent with a distributed information infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication, and the civilization that arrived in 1788 with muskets and a document declaring the land empty, is one of the most consequential cultural collisions in human history. Its consequences are still being worked through. They will not be fully resolved in our lifetimes. But they can at least be understood more clearly than they have been if we are willing to look at the evidence. If we are willing to read the fish traps at Brewarrina not as simple structures, but as engineering. If we are willing to read the aquaculture at Bujbim not as a curiosity, but as a civilizational achievement. If we are willing to read the oral traditions that preserve 12,000-year-old geological memories, not as superstition, but as science. If we are willing to read the 250 languages not as dialects, but as evidence of civilizational complexity. If we are willing to read the 65,000 years, not as a long time during which nothing happened, but as the longest duration of continuous human civilization on Earth. If we are willing to see what is actually there, what has always been there, what the evidence has always been telling us, if we are willing to see it, then the story of human civilization looks different. The timeline looks different. The hierarchy looks different. The world looks different. Not because anything new has been discovered, although new discoveries are being made all the time, but because we are finally, slowly, imperfectly beginning to look. The looking, when it happens carefully and seriously, reveals a story that is layered like the geological formations that preserve it. Each layer deeper is older, and each layer older is in some ways more surprising, because the older layers are the ones that the inherited framework of colonial history has done the most to obscure. We have spent most of our time so far looking at the major structural features of the civilization, the aquaculture and the fish traps and the songlines and the astronomical knowledge and the ecological management of the continent. But the detail is where the texture lives. And the texture is where the human reality of a civilization that lasted 65,000 years begins to become not just intellectually impressive, but emotionally present. Real, alive in a way that the broad structural account sometimes fails to convey. Consider what it would have actually meant to live in a community whose knowledge of its territory had been accumulated across 65,000 years of continuous observation. Every unusual feature of the landscape, every reliable water source, every plant that became poisonous under certain conditions and edible under others, every location where specific animals could be found at specific times of year, every pattern of weather that the behavior of local animals signaled in advance, all of this had been observed and re-observed and tested and refined across thousands of generations, and the refinements had been incorporated into the knowledge system and transmitted to the next generation. The ecological knowledge of an experienced adult in an Aboriginal community was not the product of one lifetime of learning. It was the distilled product of thousands of lifetimes of learning, each generation adding to what the previous generation had passed on, the system growing richer and more precise and more nuanced with each increment of time. Think about what this means for something as basic as water. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. Large parts of it receive less than 250 millimeters of rainfall per year. The distribution of water across the landscape is not uniform, and it is not consistent. It varies by season, by year, and by decade. Understanding where water can be found in a landscape like this, not just in a normal year but in a bad year, not just in the places where it is obvious but in the places where it is hidden, is the difference between survival and death. Aboriginal communities possess this knowledge for their territories in extraordinary depth. They knew the location of rockhole waters that only filled in certain rain events. They knew the soaks, the places where water was close enough to the surface that it could be reached by digging, that were invisible to anyone who did not know, to look for the specific vegetation signatures that indicated their presence. They knew the paths that led from one water source to the next across vast distances, and they knew the seasonal calendars of those paths, when each source was reliable and when it was not, and what alternative path could be taken if the expected source had dried. This knowledge was so precise and so comprehensive that experienced travelers could move across the driest parts of the Australian interior without carrying water, relying entirely on their knowledge of where water could be found along the route, in quantities sufficient for survival even in drought years. This is not luck. This is the product of a water management knowledge system of extraordinary sophistication, accumulated across tens of thousands of years by communities whose survival depended on getting it right every time. The same depth of knowledge applied to food. The diversity of plant foods used by Aboriginal communities has been documented by ethnobotanists who have worked closely with knowledgeable community members, and the picture that emerges is one of extraordinary dietary breadth and extraordinary processing sophistication. Not all plant foods are edible in their natural state. Many require processing to neutralize toxins, to improve digestibility, to concentrate nutrients, or simply to make them palatable. The cycad, for example, which produces large seeds rich in starch and energy, also contains powerful neurotoxins. Raw cycad seeds will kill you, but if you slice them thinly and leach them in running water for an extended period, and then dry them and grind them and bake the resulting flour, the toxins are reduced to harmless levels and the seeds become a nutritious food source. This process was developed by Aboriginal communities in regions where cycads grow, and it represents a piece of applied food chemistry that, if it were found in a European context, would be described as a significant technological achievement. It is in fact a significant technological achievement. It simply happened to be developed in Australia by people whom the colonial intellectual framework classified as primitive, and so it was described as instinct or tradition rather than as technology or science. The pharmacological knowledge embedded in Aboriginal traditions is another dimension that only researchers who have taken the time to study it in detail have been able to fully appreciate. Aboriginal communities across the continent used hundreds of plant species for medicinal purposes, applying them in forms and at dosages refined across generations of trial and observation, to conditions ranging from skin infections to respiratory problems, to pain management, to the treatment of wounds. The knowledge of which plants were useful for which conditions, in which forms, at which dosages, across which seasons, was held by specialists within the community, people who had dedicated significant portions of their lives to learning and maintaining the pharmacological knowledge of their country. This knowledge was not arbitrary. Modern pharmacological research has confirmed the therapeutic properties of many of the plants used in Aboriginal medicine, the anti-inflammatory properties of certain eucalyptus species, the antimicrobial properties of tea tree oil, which was extracted and used by Aboriginal communities in coastal New South Wales long before its modern commercial applications were developed, the wound-healing properties of certain acacia resins, the analgesic properties of plants used to manage pain in a range of conditions. The scientific validation of these traditional applications is not a modern discovery of something that was accidentally stumbled upon by primitive people. It is the confirmation, in the language of modern biochemistry, of knowledge that was developed and maintained by sophisticated applied pharmacologists operating within a different intellectual tradition, but employing the same fundamental method of careful observation, systematic testing, and the accumulation of empirical knowledge across time. The technology of water management at sites like Bujbim deserves more sustained attention than the standard summary allows, because the more carefully you look at what the Gunditjmara built, the more impressive it becomes. The volcanic landscape of the Western District of Victoria is threaded with lava flows from eruptions that occurred over the past 30,000 years. The lava flows created a landscape of ridges and channels and natural depressions that could be, with the right knowledge of water movement and the right application of strategic intervention, turned into a managed hydrological system. The Gunditjmara understood the water movement of this landscape at the level of detailed local knowledge accumulated across hundreds of generations. They identified the points in the landscape where small interventions could redirect water flows in ways that created large-scale effects downstream. They built stone weirs at these intervention points, fitted from the local basalt rock with a precision that allowed them to control water levels across large areas. They created channels connecting natural water bodies, allowing water and eels to move between them in controlled ways. They built the circular holding pools that could trap eels while allowing water to flow through, creating reservoirs of food that could be harvested at need rather than only during the seasonal runs. And they built the smoking platforms where the eels could be preserved for extended storage and long-distance trade. The stone construction at Bujbim is dry stonework built without mortar from the basalt that is abundant in the volcanic landscape. The technique of dry stone construction requires a detailed knowledge of how stones of different shapes and sizes can be fitted together to create structures that are stable and that can resist the forces applied to them by water, by animals, and by the freeze-thaw cycles of temperature change. The stone structures at Bujbim have survived for more than 6,000 years in a wet environment with significant seasonal flooding. They were built correctly. They were built to last. And they were maintained across the generations by the community that built them, because a structure that is built correctly and maintained consistently can last indefinitely in appropriate conditions. The 6,600-year-old date is a minimum age for the system. The actual system may be older, with the oldest sections no longer accessible for dating because they have been modified and rebuilt over millennia of maintenance and expansion. The eel species that the Bujbim aquaculture system was designed to harvest is the shortfin eel Anguilla australis. Shortfin eels are remarkable animals. They spend most of their lives in fresh water, growing slowly in rivers and lakes across southeastern Australia. Then, when they reach reproductive maturity, they migrate to the Coral Sea to breed and die. They are extremely long-lived. Individual shortfin eels can reach ages of more than 30 years, and in managed conditions, even longer. The Gunditjmara understood the biology of the shortfin eel at a level of practical detail that allowed them to design an aquaculture system specifically adapted to the eel's behavioral patterns. The traps and channels were designed to exploit the eel's tendency to move toward water flow. The holding pools exploited the eel's preference for specific shelter conditions. The seasonal timing of harvesting was calibrated to the natural movement patterns of the eel population through the landscape. This is not guesswork. This is detailed applied knowledge of a specific animal's ecology, developed through thousands of years of close observation and practical engagement, embedded in a food production system that was both productive and sustainable. The eel population at Bujbim was not depleted by the harvest. It was managed in a way that maintained the population while extracting surplus. This is the definition of sustainable aquaculture, and it was being practiced at Bujbim more than 2,000 years before Stonehenge was built. The trade networks that connected Bujbim to the broader Aboriginal world are a dimension of the story that is rarely told in detail, but that is important for understanding the scale of the civilizational achievement. The smoked eels produced at Bujbim were not only consumed locally, they were traded across the region and, through chains of exchange, across much wider distances. The Gunditjmara and their neighbours participated in a trade system that extended across much of southeastern Australia, with goods moving along established routes, changing hands at regular meeting places, carrying information as well as material value from one community to the next. The ceremonial gatherings at which this trade occurred were also the occasions for the performance of shared traditions, for the maintenance of the kinship connections between communities, for the resolution of disputes and the negotiation of territorial boundaries. They were the occasions, in other words, at which the civilization renewed itself, reaffirmed its shared values and shared laws, and maintained the connections between its distributed and autonomous communities that gave it its continental scale without requiring a central authority or a coercive state apparatus. The archaeology of these trade relationships is visible in the material record at Bujbim and at other sites in the region. Stone tools made from raw materials that are not locally available, shell ornaments from coastal species, objects that carry the stylistic signatures of distant communities. These are the physical residues of a trade system that was maintaining connections across thousands of kilometres of the Australian landscape at a time when the equivalent distances in Europe were being traversed only rarely and with enormous difficulty. The infrastructure that made these connections possible was not roads in the Roman sense or ships in the Greek sense. It was the knowledge infrastructure of the song lines, which encoded the routes between communities and the protocols for safe travel between territories, and the social infrastructure of the kinship system, which created relationships of obligation and reciprocity between individuals in distant communities that obligated them to receive travelers from linked communities safely, to feed and shelter them, and to facilitate their onward journey. The kinship system of Aboriginal Australia is one of the most sophisticated social organisational structures ever developed by human societies, and it is one of the most consistently misunderstood by the non-Aboriginal commentators who have described it. The popular image of Aboriginal kinship as a simple tribal structure in which everyone in a community is related to everyone else in obvious and straightforward ways is completely inaccurate. Aboriginal kinship systems are complex relational structures that assign every individual to specific categories defined by their parentage and their community affiliations, and that specify in detail the rights and obligations that exist between individuals of different categories. These specifications include who may marry whom, how economic resources must be shared between individuals of different categories, what ceremonial roles each category plays, and how disputes between individuals of different categories must be managed. The system is, among other things, a mechanism for preventing the inbreeding that would threaten the health of small isolated populations by creating strict rules about which individuals may form reproductive partnerships and ensuring that these rules channel reproduction toward pairings between individuals who are not closely related. It is a genetic management system, developed long before the modern understanding of genetics, operating on the same principles of managed outbreeding that modern genetics would prescribe for the maintenance of healthy populations. 65,000 years of operating this system has produced the most outbred and genetically diverse major human population on Earth. The kinship system is also, and this is the dimension of it that is most directly relevant to the question of civilization, a continental governance structure, because the kinship categories that apply within a community also apply across communities. A person arriving in a community they have never visited before can establish, through the protocols of kinship category identification, what their relationship is to the members of that community and what obligations and rights flow from that relationship. A traveller of Category X arriving in a community knows that the individuals of Category Y in that community are their brothers and sisters, with all the mutual obligations that relationship implies. The individuals of Category Z are their in-laws, with different but equally specific obligations. The kinship system creates a template for relationship between any two individuals in the broader Aboriginal world, regardless of whether they have ever met, based on their respective kinship categories and the categories of those they are connected to. It is a distributed governance system with no central authority and no coercive enforcement mechanism, operating across a continent through the internal obligations that the kinship categories create in every individual who has been raised within the system. It is, in this sense, a more subtle and more resilient governance structure than anything that has been produced by centralized state building, because it does not depend on the continued existence of a central authority to function. It functions as long as the community members understand and observe its obligations, which they do because those obligations are encoded in the deepest layers of their cultural identity and maintained by the continuous social reinforcement of ceremonial life. The ceremonial economy of Aboriginal Australia is another dimension that gets less attention than it deserves. The great ceremonies, the initiation rituals, the seasonal gatherings, the ceremonies of increase that were believed to promote the fertility and abundance of specific plants and animals, were not simply spiritual events, they were economic events. They were occasions on which significant quantities of goods changed hands, on which social debts were incurred and repaid, on which the obligations of the kinship system were made tangible through the exchange of material goods. The ceremonial economy created a system of distributed resource management across the continent, in which surplus production in one region could be directed through the channels of ceremonial exchange to regions experiencing shortage, in which the productive capacity of different environments at different times of year could be pooled across communities connected by ceremonial relationships. This is not a market economy. It does not operate through the price mechanism of supply and demand. It operates through the social mechanism of obligation and reciprocity, encoded in kinship and ceremony. But it achieves, across the enormous environmental variability of the Australian continent, a smoothing of resource access that is functionally comparable to what market economies achieve through the price mechanism. It is a different solution to the same problem, and it has the advantage over the market mechanism of not requiring the coercive infrastructure of property law and contract enforcement to function. It operates through shared values and shared identity, not through external compulsion. The night sky above Australia, unobscured by the light pollution that renders it nearly invisible in most developed countries, is itself a library. The astronomical traditions of Aboriginal communities encoded knowledge of the night sky that served multiple practical functions simultaneously. The rising and setting positions of specific stars and star groups marked the seasons and the associated ecological events that structured the annual food calendar. The appearance of the Pleiades star cluster above the eastern horizon just before sunrise, for example, marks the beginning of winter in southeastern Australia, and in Aboriginal traditions is associated with the onset of cold weather and the need to shift food sources toward those that are available in winter. The helical rising of the Pleiades, visible in the early morning sky in late May, signals the time to prepare for the colder months, to harvest and store the plant foods that will be most needed when winter reduces the availability of fresh food. The astronomical calendar encoded in these traditions is a practical tool for ecological management, integrated with the songlines and the broader knowledge system in a way that makes the stars themselves part of the infrastructure of civilizational knowledge. The dark cloud constellations that we mentioned earlier, defined by the dark patches in the Milky Way rather than by star groups, represent a completely original astronomical tradition. In the European and Middle Eastern astronomical traditions, which form the basis of modern astronomy, constellations are defined by connecting bright stars into patterns that resemble animals or mythological figures. The Aboriginal Australian tradition includes this kind of constellation as well, but it also includes constellations defined by the dark spaces in the Milky Way, by the interstellar dust clouds that block the light of more distant stars. These dark cloud constellations include the Emu in the sky, the Goanna, and others, each associated with specific seasonal events in the natural world. The emu in the sky rises in the position appropriate for emu nesting season, and in communities that hunted emus and harvested emu eggs, the appearance of the emu constellation was the signal that the eggs were ready to be collected. This is an integration of astronomical observation with ecological management that has no direct parallel in any other astronomical tradition. It reflects a way of looking at the sky that was developed independently over tens of thousands of years by communities whose relationship with the natural world was so intimate and so practically oriented that even their astronomy was embedded in the management of food resources. The sky, in this tradition, is not separate from the earth and the ecology of the earth. It is part of the same continuous system, and knowledge of the sky is knowledge of how that system works. The deep time dimension of Aboriginal astronomical traditions is itself remarkable. If the oral traditions preserving accurate memory of sea level rise events from 12,000 years ago are genuine, then those same traditions may also preserve accurate memory of astronomical events from that period. The sky of 12,000 years ago was not quite the same as the sky of today, because the wobble of the Earth's axis on a 26,000-year cycle, called precession, slowly changes the orientation of the Earth relative to the fixed stars. Over 12,000 years, this precession shifts the position of the pole star and changes the rising and setting positions of stars and constellations significantly. If Aboriginal astronomical traditions encode memories that go back 12,000 years, then they may preserve information about the sky as it appeared 12,000 years ago, information that cannot be independently verified from any surviving written or material record. Researchers in cultural astronomy have been exploring this possibility, looking for evidence in the detailed astronomical knowledge of Aboriginal communities that could only have been accurately observed from 12,000 years ago. The investigation is preliminary and the conclusions are uncertain, but the possibility is real. And if it is confirmed, it would extend the verified knowledge preservation capacity of Aboriginal oral traditions beyond even the remarkable threshold established by the sea level rise work into a domain of knowledge about the sky that was lost to all other human traditions when the civilizations that possessed it were disrupted by the great transitions of the Holocene. The legal and institutional dimensions of Aboriginal civilization are among the hardest to describe in terms that translate across the vast cultural distance between the world that produced them and the world in which most of this accounts audience lives. The concept of law in Aboriginal culture is not separated from the concept of cosmology. Law, in the Aboriginal sense, is not a set of rules created by human authorities and enforced by human institutions. It is the structure of reality itself, the way things are required to be, because they were established that way in the deep past by the actions of the ancestral beings whose journeys across the landscape created the features of the country and established the relationships between all the elements of the natural and social world. The dreaming is the name most commonly used in English for this foundational order, though the term is imprecise because it suggests a vagueness and an insubstantiality that is contrary to the Aboriginal understanding. The dreaming is not a dream in the sense of something imagined. It is the underlying reality of which the material world is the surface expression. It is the pattern that the world follows. And law, in the Aboriginal sense, is the set of behaviors and relationships and obligations that accord with that pattern. Law is how things must be done, not because a human authority has decreed it, but because the nature of reality requires it. This understanding of law has a practical consequence that is directly relevant to the governance of a continental civilization. Because law is embedded in the landscape itself, in the features of the country that were created by the ancestral beings, and that encode the relationships and obligations of law in their physical form, law is inescapable in a way that human-made law is not. You cannot bribe a mountain or corrupt a river. The features of the country that embody law are permanent and public and available to everyone. There is no separate legal institution that must be maintained and can be corrupted. The law lives in the land, and as long as the community maintains its relationship with the land and its knowledge of what the land means, the law is present and operative. This is a governance structure of extraordinary elegance. It maintains the authority of law without requiring a coercive enforcement apparatus. It distributes the knowledge of law across the entire community without requiring a professional class of lawyers. It makes law permanent and unchallengeable because it embeds law in the physical world rather than in the changeable decisions of human institutions. The application of this system to the management of a continent worked through the song lines, which encoded the law of specific territories in the songs associated with those territories. A community traveling through the territory of another community was bound by the law encoded in the songs of that territory, known to them through their own partial knowledge of the songline and through the knowledge shared at ceremonial gatherings. Violations of that law were adjudicated at the great gatherings by the assembled community of those whose territories were affected, applying the standards encoded in the songline and the broader tradition. Penalties were real and were enforced, not through a police force or a prison system, but through the withdrawal of the social supports that made life in the community viable. A person who had violated law and had not made appropriate restitution was isolated, in a world where isolation was genuinely dangerous, from the community of obligations and support that sustained everyone's survival. The social mechanism of enforcement was more effective, in the conditions of the Australian interior, than any institutional enforcement mechanism could have been, because it operated through the deepest social instincts of human beings, the need for belonging and the fear of exclusion, rather than through external force. The diversity of ecological zones across the Australian continent, from the tropical rainforests of Queensland to the cold temperate forests of Tasmania, to the arid interior to the Mediterranean climate forests of the southwest, is reflected in the diversity of the civilizational adaptations that Aboriginal communities developed in different regions. There is no single model of Aboriginal civilization that applies across the entire continent. What existed was a family of civilizations, sharing deep common roots in the original founding migration and the dreaming tradition that developed from it, but diverging over tens of thousands of years into regionally specific forms adapted to the specific ecological and environmental conditions of each region. The communities of the tropical north, with access to year-round rainfall and abundant marine resources, developed different food management strategies, different architectural traditions, different ceremonial forms, different artistic traditions from the communities of the arid center. The communities of the fertile southeast, with their aquaculture and their complex trade networks and their large ceremonial gatherings, were different again from the communities of the Kimberley, with their extraordinary rock art tradition and their intimate knowledge of the wet-dry seasonal cycle. And the communities of Tasmania, isolated by the flooding of the Bass Strait 10,000 years ago and developing in isolation for the entire Holocene period, were different again from all of them. The Tasmanian case is particularly instructive because it illustrates a principle about civilizational resilience and vulnerability that is relevant to the broader story. When the Bass Strait flooded between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, the communities in what became Tasmania were cut off from the mainland. At that point, they had all the knowledge and all the technologies that their mainland contemporaries possessed, including the ability to make bone tools and to catch and eat fish. Approximately 3,500 years after the flooding, in a development that has puzzled researchers since it was first documented, bone tools and fish disappear from the Tasmanian archaeological record. The communities of Tasmania stopped making bone tools and stopped eating fish. Why? One explanation that has been explored is the population size hypothesis. The techniques for making bone tools and for fishing in Tasmanian waters required periodic innovation and refinement to remain effective. On the mainland, with populations large enough to support many specialists, and with the constant stimulus of exchange with other communities, the techniques could be maintained and improved. In Tasmania, with a smaller and more isolated population, the communities were operating closer to the minimum viable population for maintaining complex skills. When practitioners of specific techniques died without having fully transmitted those techniques to successors, the techniques were lost and could not be reconstructed without the constant intellectual stimulus of contact with a larger world. The Tasmanians did not become less intelligent. They became more isolated, and in isolation, below a certain population threshold, the maintenance of complex skills becomes precarious. This is a principle about civilizational resilience that has implications far beyond the Tasmanian case. Civilizations require a certain critical mass of intellectual diversity to remain innovative and to maintain complex skills across generational transitions. The isolation of Aboriginal communities from each other, enforced by the colonial disruption of the songlines and the ceremonial trade networks, created conditions analogous to the Tasmanian isolation for communities across the continent. The knowledge losses of the colonial period were not random. They were predictable consequences of disrupting the social infrastructure that maintained complex knowledge across communities. The mainland communities, before 1788, were not isolated in the Tasmanian sense. The songlines and the ceremonial networks maintained contact between communities across the continent and ensured the circulation of people, ideas, innovations, and knowledge between communities that would otherwise have been too small to maintain the full complexity of the civilizational knowledge base. The mainland Aboriginal civilization was, in effect, a distributed knowledge network, with each community holding a piece of the whole and participating in the exchange of knowledge at the great gatherings. The disruption of that network was a civilizational catastrophe, not just because it killed people, though it killed people in enormous numbers, but because it severed the connections that had maintained the knowledge network for tens of thousands of years. Communities that might each separately have been too small to maintain the full complexity of Aboriginal knowledge were, through the network, able to collectively maintain it. Destroy the network and you destroy the capacity of the system to maintain its own complexity. The knowledge losses of the colonial period are not simply losses of individual pieces of information. They are the systemic degradation of a knowledge network that had operated successfully for 65,000 years. This understanding of what was lost helps explain why the recovery of that knowledge is so difficult and so incomplete. It is not simply a matter of consulting the surviving practitioners and writing down what they know. Some of that knowledge has been lost completely, because all the practitioners who held it are dead and the communities that maintained it were disrupted before adequate documentation could be made. Some of that knowledge is held in forms that cannot be fully transmitted outside the ceremonial context in which it is embedded, because the knowledge is not separable from the practice that maintains and makes it meaningful. Some of that knowledge is properly held in confidence, restricted to those who have been appropriately initiated, and its transmission outside that context would itself be a violation of the law that governs it. And some of that knowledge requires the specific country to which it applies, because it is knowledge about that specific landscape, and without the landscape it is incomplete. The partial recovery that is happening is, nonetheless, genuinely significant. The reintroduction of traditional fire management practices in parts of Victoria, Queensland, and the Northern Territory is producing measurable ecological benefits. The collaborative mapping of traditional ecological knowledge in partnership with Aboriginal communities is creating resources that are both scientifically valuable and culturally respectful. The legal recognition of native title, incomplete and contested as it is, has returned to Aboriginal communities some degree of recognized connection to their countries and some degree of practical ability to participate in the management of those countries. The recognition of the Budgebim aquaculture as a World Heritage civilizational achievement has changed the public story of Australian prehistory in ways that are still working their way through the educational and cultural institutions of the country. The growing body of ancient DNA research, conducted with the consent and participation of Aboriginal communities, is producing an increasingly detailed picture of the deep history of the human population of the continent. And that picture is consistently more complex and more impressive than the standard narrative would suggest. The revisions to the standard narrative are accelerating. In 2017, the 65,000-year date. In 2019, the Budgebim World Heritage inscription. In the early 2020s, the growing recognition in Australian schools and public discourse of the frontier wars as a genuine and significant part of Australian history. In 2023, the Voice referendum, which even in its defeat revealed the depth of the ongoing argument about the relationship between the Australian state and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who are its oldest inhabitants. Each of these developments is a small piece of a much larger process of reckoning with what was actually here before 1788 and what was done to it after. The reckoning is incomplete. It will remain incomplete for a long time because the losses are real and many of them are permanent, and because the institutional resistance to a full accounting is real and is embedded in legal and economic structures that will not change quickly, but the direction of change is clear. The evidence is too strong and too abundant to be permanently suppressed. The testimony of the fish traps and the aquaculture systems and the astronomical traditions and the 65,000-year date is not going away. It is being added to constantly by new research, and each piece of new evidence makes the old story less tenable. The old story, the story of empty land and wandering nomads and a primitive people at the base of the evolutionary ladder of civilization, was never true. It was always a fiction, constructed to serve specific interests, and maintained because the institutional power that constructed it was also the institutional power that decided what was taught in schools, and what was published in textbooks, and what was represented in museums. That institutional power has not disappeared, but it has been challenged, and the challenges have produced real change, even if that change has been slower and more incomplete than the scale of the injustice demands. What has not changed, and cannot be changed, is the evidence. The evidence of 65,000 years of continuous human civilization on the Australian continent is permanent. It is in the genes of the Aboriginal people who are alive today. It is in the lake sediments that preserve the charcoal record of tens of thousands of years of fire management. It is in the stone structures of the Budj Bim aquaculture system, which have survived more than 6,000 years of flooding and seasonal change. It is in the rock walls of the Browarina fish traps, which may be the oldest human-made structure on Earth. It is in the million rock engravings at Murujuga, some of which may depict animals that went extinct 45,000 years ago. It is in the oral traditions that preserved accurate geological memory across 12,000 years, and that are still being spoken by people who learned them from their elders, going back through generations too numerous to count. The evidence is not going away. The civilization was real. It lasted longer than any other. It was more ecologically sophisticated than any other. It was, in its own terms, and by any fair assessment, one of the greatest achievements of the human species. And it deserves to be understood, taught, recognized, and honored as such. Not because its descendants need us to acknowledge it, though they are owed that acknowledgement. Not because the acknowledgement will undo the destruction of the past 2.5 centuries, though the acknowledgement is a necessary step in any honest reckoning with that destruction, but because the story of human civilization is incomplete without it, because any account of what human beings have been capable of that leaves out 65,000 years of continuous achievement on the driest inhabited continent on Earth is a false account. An account that begins the human story 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia is not beginning the human story. It is beginning one regional chapter of a much longer story, and it is mistaking that chapter for the whole. The whole story began 65,000 years ago on the northern shores of a continent that had never before heard a human voice. It begins with a group of people who had walked out of Africa and across the landmass that is now Southeast Asia, and who crossed a stretch of open water to reach a new world. They were carrying in their minds and in their culture the accumulated learning of their ancestors, and they were carrying in their genes the legacy of at least 2 separate episodes of interbreeding with Denisovan peoples, who were themselves the product of a long and complex human evolutionary history. They arrived. They looked at the landscape, and they began, in the way that human beings everywhere have always done when they arrive somewhere new, to learn it, to learn what it produced and what it required, to learn how to live in it and how to sustain it, to learn, over generations and centuries and millennia, how to manage a relationship with a continent so intimate and so deep that the continent itself became the primary archive of their civilization, the surface on which they inscribed their knowledge in the form of rock art and burning patterns and stone channels and fish traps and sacred sites and the roots of the songlines. They learned a continent. They managed a continent. They sustained a civilization on a continent for 65,000 years. And then, in the space of a few generations, the civilization that had sustained them was officially declared not to have existed. Terra nullius, empty land, a place where nothing had happened, a place with no history worth recording, The declaration was wrong. It has always been wrong. And the evidence that it was wrong, the evidence of what was actually here, is still here, still being uncovered, still being spoken by people whose ancestors spoke it for 65,000 years. That is the story the textbooks left out. That is the version the evidence tells, if you are willing to look at it. It is the longest story in human history. It is the story of the oldest civilization on Earth, and it begins not with a city, not with a writing system, not with a pyramid or a temple or a palace. It begins with a group of people arriving on the shore of an unknown continent 65,000 years ago and beginning, patiently and intelligently, and over a time that makes all of recorded history look like an afternoon, to understand where they had arrived. They understood it. Completely. More completely than anyone else has ever understood any piece of the earth. They encoded that understanding in songs and ceremonies and stories and in the landscape itself, in ways that have partially survived the most sustained attempt to erase a civilization that the modern world has ever seen. And that partial survival, the language is still spoken, the knowledge still held, the fish traps still in the river, the stone channels of the aquaculture still visible in the volcanic landscape of Western Victoria, is the proof that the civilization was real, was magnificent, was here, before Stonehenge, before Egypt, before any of the civilizations we were taught to call the beginning of human achievement. This was here. These people were here. This knowledge was here. This civilization was here. And no legal doctrine, and no colonial anthropology, and no textbook that starts its account of human achievement in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago can change the fact that it was here first. 65,000 years first. The oldest civilization on Earth, on the oldest continent of human habitation, built by people who understood their world more deeply than perhaps any other human beings who have ever lived. That is not a primitive story. That is the greatest story. And it is time it was told that way. The fish traps at Brew Arena are still in the river. The stone channels at Budj Bim are still in the volcanic landscape of Western Victoria. The rock engravings at Murujuga are still on the red granite of the Pilbara. The songs that encode the geography of the songlines are still being sung by people who learned them from people who learned them, from people stretching back through more generations than the mind easily contains. The oldest civilization on Earth is not gone. It was damaged. It was disrupted. It was officially declared not to have existed. But it is not gone. And the story of what it built, and what was done to it, and how it survived, and what it means that it survived, is the story that Australia owes to itself, and owes to the world. The version in the textbooks was not the truth. This is closer to the truth. And the truth matters, because a civilization that lasted 65,000 years deserves to be known for what it was, not for the fiction that was invented to justify taking everything from it, but for what it actually was: the oldest, the longest, the most patient, the most enduring, the first. There is a particular kind of silence that sits inside the evidence, a silence that the evidence itself creates by existing. When you stand beside the Brew Arena fish traps and look at the millions of stones fitted together across 400 meters of river, a structure that has been sitting in that water for longer than any building in Egypt or Europe or Asia, the silence is the silence of a story that was told and then deliberately ignored. The stones are loud in their own way. They insist on being seen for what they are. And what they are is engineering. The kind of engineering that requires accumulated knowledge, generational transmission, community organization, and a relationship with a specific piece of landscape so intimate and so long sustained that the relationship itself becomes a form of technology. The fish traps at Brew Arena are not simply old structures. They are the physical expression of a relationship between a people and a river that has been maintained continuously for longer than most civilizations have existed. The Njemba people, whose country includes the Brewarina fish traps, have oral traditions about the traps that describe them not as human constructions, but as the work of the creator being Bayami, who shaped them in the dreaming time. This is not a contradiction of the scientific account. It is a different way of making the same point. The fish traps were not made in a week or a decade. They were made by the accumulated work of generations, each generation adding to and maintaining what the previous generation had built, across a span of time so vast that from the perspective of any individual generation, the traps had always been there. They had always been part of the landscape. They had always been part of the relationship between the Njemba people and the Barwon River. In a culture without writing, in which the past beyond living memory is encoded in cosmological narrative rather than historical chronicle, the appropriate description of something that has always been there is that the creator made it. The dreaming is not mythology in the sense of fiction. It is the indigenous equivalent of deep time. It is the way a culture without a writing system represents events and processes that lie beyond the reach of living memory, but that shape the world that living people inhabit. The Barwon River at Brewarina, in the period before European settlement, significantly altered the hydrology of the system through upstream clearing and later through the construction of dams and weirs that changed the flow regime, was one of the most productive freshwater fishing environments in inland Australia. The fish traps were designed to work with that productivity, to channel it and concentrate it and make it reliably accessible in a way that supported a stable and substantial population in a region that, without the management intelligence embedded in the trap system, would have supported a much smaller and less settled community. The trap system was not a supplementary food source. It was a primary food production infrastructure, the anchor around which the settlement pattern of the Ngemba and their neighbours was organised, the resource that made possible the density of population and the stability of settlement that the surrounding landscape could not, without management, have supported. This is the pattern that repeats across the continent, in different ecological settings and with different specific technologies, but with the same underlying logic. Aboriginal communities did not simply exploit the natural productivity of the landscapes they occupied. They actively managed that productivity, developing technologies and practices specific to each landscape that increased its carrying capacity above the natural baseline and stabilized that carrying capacity against the variability that comes with seasonal and interannual fluctuations in rainfall and temperature. The fire management practices of the Victoria Mallee country, the aquaculture of the Gunditjmara, the fish traps of the Ngemba, the yam daisy management of the southeastern grasslands, the grain harvesting and processing practices of the arid interior, all of these are expressions of the same underlying intelligence. The intelligence that looks at a landscape and asks not just what is here, but what could be here with the right management, and then develops the management practices, the knowledge systems, the institutional structures, and the multi-generational commitment necessary to make the what could be a reality. The yam daisy, or murnong, which was the staple food of the communities of the southeastern grasslands before sheep and cattle eliminated it from most of its former range, is a particularly instructive case. The murnong is a small daisy with an edible tuberous root that was, in the grasslands of what is now Victoria and New South Wales, extraordinarily abundant before European settlement. Early pastoral settlers described grasslands white with murnong flowers in spring and described Aboriginal women harvesting the roots with digging sticks in quantities that seemed remarkable to observers accustomed to a European understanding of food production. What those observers did not understand was that the abundance of murnong they were seeing was not the natural abundance of an unmanaged landscape. It was the managed abundance of a landscape that had been tended for the murnong's benefit through regular burning that created the open conditions the murnong preferred, through the harvesting practices that, by regularly disturbing the soil around the plants, actually stimulated their regeneration, and possibly through deliberate transplanting or encouragement of murnong growth in areas where the conditions were particularly favorable. The Murnong grasslands of southeastern Australia were, in effect, gardens. Not gardens in the European sense of bounded, intensively cultivated plots, but gardens in the sense of managed landscapes, where human intervention had transformed the productivity of the natural system in favor of the species most useful to the community managing them. When sheep were introduced to the grasslands of southeastern Australia in the early 19th century, they ate the Murnong. Not selectively. They ate everything. And in a landscape without the grazing pressure of large herding animals in its ecological history, which was the natural state of the Australian continent before the introduction of European livestock, the vegetation had no evolved defences against intensive grazing. Within a few years of the introduction of sheep, the Murnong was gone from vast areas where it had formerly been extraordinarily abundant. The food base of the communities that had managed those grasslands for the Murnong's benefit was destroyed. The communities were simultaneously being displaced from those grasslands by the pastoral expansion. The destruction of the Murnong was not simply an ecological event. It was a civilizational catastrophe. It destroyed the primary food production infrastructure that had sustained specific communities in specific territories for thousands of years, and it did so at the same moment that those communities were being displaced from the territories in which their knowledge of that food infrastructure was applicable. The double blow of the destruction of the food base and the destruction of the relationship with country was more devastating, in many regions, than direct violence would have been, because it undermined the practical basis for the entire way of life that the civilization had developed over thousands of years of adaptation to those specific landscapes. The pastoral expansion of the 19th century is one of the least understood and least discussed mechanisms of civilizational destruction in the history of Australian colonialism. The conventional account focuses on the frontier violence, on the killings and dispersals of Aboriginal communities that accompanied the pastoral expansion. That violence was real and was devastating. But the ecological destruction that the pastoral expansion entailed was, in some ways, more thorough and more permanent because it altered the landscapes on which Aboriginal knowledge systems were based in ways that made the recovery of those knowledge systems enormously difficult even after the violence ended. You can rebuild a community. You cannot, in any short time frame, rebuild a landscape that has been fundamentally altered by the introduction of grazing pressure that the ecological system had no history of adapting to. The grasslands of southeastern Australia have not recovered their Murnong abundance in 2 centuries of European settlement. In many areas, they probably never will, because the ecological conditions that produce that abundance have been permanently altered by 2 centuries of intensive grazing, by the introduction of European pasture species that outcompete the native vegetation, by the disruption of the fire regimes that had maintained the open conditions the native species required. The inland waterways were altered in similar ways. The Barwon River system, in which the Brewarina fish traps were built, has been fundamentally changed by 2 centuries of upstream land clearing, irrigation extraction, and flow regulation. The flooding events that periodically refreshed the fish trap system with new cohorts of fish that were part of the ecological cycle the trap system was designed to exploit have been significantly reduced in frequency and magnitude by upstream water management infrastructure. The river carries less water than it once did. It carries more sediment because the removal of riparian vegetation from its banks has increased erosion. The fish populations that the traps were designed to harvest have been reduced by a combination of habitat degradation, altered flow regimes, and the introduction of invasive fish species. The Brewarina fish traps still exist, in part, but the ecological system that the traps were designed to interact with has been substantially changed. The traps are, in a sense, still there, but the civilization that built and maintained them and that knew how to use them has been disrupted in ways that have made the full resumption of the management practices that sustained them impossible without a much larger ecological restoration effort than has yet been attempted. Understanding this ecological dimension of the colonial destruction is important because it explains one of the most persistent misconceptions about the recovery of Aboriginal civilization. The misconception is that recovery is primarily a matter of cultural recovery, of reviving languages and ceremonies and knowledge systems that were disrupted by the colonial process. That is certainly part of it. But the cultural recovery is inseparable from the ecological recovery. The knowledge systems that Aboriginal civilization developed over 65,000 years are knowledge systems about specific landscapes. They are embedded in those landscapes in the sense that they describe specific features of those landscapes, specific species in those landscapes, specific ecological processes in those landscapes. Recovery of that knowledge requires not just the knowledge itself, but the landscape to which it refers. A community that has recovered its language and its ceremonies, but that lives in a landscape that has been fundamentally altered by 2 centuries of intensive European use, is in the position of having recovered the book, but lost the book. Library it describes. The recovery has to be both cultural and ecological, and the ecological recovery is in many cases more difficult and more long-term than the cultural recovery. The fire management story is instructive here, because it is one area where both the cultural knowledge and the landscape are sufficiently intact for meaningful recovery to be possible, and where the results of that recovery are already visible and measurable. The return of traditional burning to parts of the Australian landscape has been driven by a combination of ecological research demonstrating the benefits of the practice and cultural determination by Aboriginal communities to reassert their management role in their countries. In the wet tropics of northeastern Queensland, the Fire Sticks Alliance has been facilitating the reintroduction of cultural burning across a range of Aboriginal communities, with results that include improved biodiversity outcomes, reduced fuel loads that translate to reduced catastrophic fire risk, and the revival of knowledge and practice among community members who had not previously had the opportunity to learn and apply traditional burning techniques. In the Yorta Yorta country in Victoria, traditional burning practices have been reintroduced in collaboration with Parks Victoria, with similar ecological and cultural benefits. In the Northern Territory, where some communities maintained a more continuous connection to burning practice through the disruptions of the colonial period, the integration of traditional burning knowledge with contemporary fire management is already well advanced and producing documented ecological outcomes that modern fire management alone had been unable to achieve. The fire management revival is not simply an ecological story, it is a civilizational recovery story. It is the story of a knowledge system that was accumulated across 65,000 years, that was disrupted but not destroyed by the colonial process, and that is being reintegrated into the management of the landscape it was developed to manage. Every controlled burn carried out by a traditional owner using knowledge inherited from ancestors is an act of civilizational continuity. It is the renewal of a practice that predates every civilization in the textbooks. It is the assertion that the oldest civilization on Earth is not simply a historical fact but a living reality, that its knowledge is not simply an archive to be preserved but a tool to be applied, that its practitioners are not museum pieces, but managers with a relationship to their country that no subsequent occupant of that country has been able to replicate or to replace. The genomic story is another dimension of the recovery, and it is one that is still unfolding rapidly as sequencing technology improves and as the collaborative research model between scientists and Aboriginal communities produces larger and more comprehensive data sets. The ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains from across the continent, combined with modern genome data from living Aboriginal Australians, is producing a picture of the population history of the continent that is far more complex and far more interesting than any previous account could have suggested. The picture shows not a single founding population that spread across the continent in a relatively simple pattern, but a complex network of populations that moved and mixed and differentiated and reconnected across 65,000 years of geological, climatic, and social change. It shows that the genetic diversity of Aboriginal Australia is extraordinary, that different regional populations have been genetically distinct for very long periods, and that the patterns of genetic differentiation map onto the patterns of linguistic and cultural differentiation in ways that confirm the long-term stability of the regional populations and their relationships. One of the most striking findings from ancient Australian DNA research is the evidence for a period of significant genetic change in Australia approximately 4,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the introduction of the dingo to the continent. The dingo is a dog that was introduced to Australia from somewhere in Southeast Asia, almost certainly by human beings, approximately 4,000 years ago. It is the only large predator to have arrived in Australia in the Holocene period, and its introduction had significant ecological effects, as an apex predator reshaping the food web of the continent. But the genetic evidence suggests that the dingo's arrival coincided with a significant population movement and genetic exchange event in the Australian interior, one that introduced new genetic material from mainland Asia into a population that had been isolated for tens of thousands of years. The mechanism of this exchange is unclear. One possibility is that the people who brought the dingo also left some genetic descendants in the continent. Another possibility is that the ecological changes caused by the dingo's introduction, which altered the distribution and behavior of prey species across the continent, forced changes in human movement patterns that brought previously isolated populations into contact and exchange. The question is open and the research is ongoing. But the finding itself is significant because it shows that Australia was not as completely isolated from the rest of the world during the Holocene as has sometimes been assumed, and that the genetic history of the continent has more external connections than the 65,000-year founding narrative would suggest. The dingo itself deserves a moment of attention because its ecological role in the Australian continent is directly relevant to the question of landscape management. The dingo was, for approximately 4,000 years before European settlement, the apex terrestrial predator of the Australian mainland. It occupied the ecological niche that large carnivores occupy in other ecosystems around the world, controlling the populations of medium-sized herbivores and preventing the overgrazing of vegetation that would result if those populations were unchecked. The dingo's presence was a significant factor in maintaining the ecological balance of the landscapes that Aboriginal communities were managing. When European settlers began killing dingoes as a threat to sheep, they removed an important regulator of the ecosystem. The consequences of dingo removal include population explosions of kangaroos in some areas, which have resulted in significant overgrazing and vegetation damage. The dingo fence, a barrier more than 5,000 kilometres long that divides much of inland Australia into dingo-present and dingo-absent zones, is one of the largest human-made structures on Earth, and its ecological legacy is a continent divided between two different ecological regimes, one with and one without its apex predator. The dingo, brought to Australia 4,000 years ago, possibly by the same people or the same trade networks that facilitated other connections between Australia and the Asian mainland in the mid-Holocene, became in 4,000 years an integral part of the Australian ecological system. The removal of that predator in the colonial period is another example of the disruption of the ecological management framework that Aboriginal civilization had maintained for tens of thousands of years. The archaeology of the arid interior of Australia is a field that is producing findings that consistently revise upward the estimate of the civilizational achievement of the people who lived there. The arid interior of Australia, which covers roughly 3/4 of the continent, is an environment of extreme challenge. Rainfall is sparse and highly variable. Water is scarce and often found only in specific geological formations that require detailed knowledge to locate. Food is scattered and seasonal. The environmental conditions of the arid interior are, by any conventional measure, among the most challenging that human beings have ever successfully occupied. And yet Aboriginal communities occupied the arid interior continuously for tens of thousands of years, including through the extreme arid phase of the last glacial maximum. When the interior was significantly drier and hotter than it is today, they occupied it successfully, not despite the challenge, but through the application of the accumulated knowledge that turned those challenges into a manageable problem. Knowledge of water sources, knowledge of food, resources, and their seasonal patterns, knowledge of fire management techniques appropriate to arid conditions, knowledge of the movement patterns of animals that concentrated at specific locations at specific times of year, and the social and institutional infrastructure of the songlines and the kinship system, which maintained connections across the vast distances of the interior, and ensured that the knowledge of distant water sources and food resources was available to communities in need. The ability of Aboriginal communities to survive and thrive in the arid interior through the last glacial maximum, when conditions were significantly more challenging than at any time in the subsequent Holocene period, is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human adaptation. The last glacial maximum, which reached its most extreme conditions approximately 20,000 years ago, produced in Australia a landscape that was significantly drier, colder at night, and windier than the modern arid interior. The large lakes that exist in parts of the interior today were mostly dry or significantly reduced. The vegetation was sparse and wind-blown. The food resources were concentrated in specific refugia within the landscape, and human communities survived in this environment. They survived with the knowledge they had accumulated over the preceding tens of thousands of years, knowledge that was sophisticated enough to sustain human life in conditions that would have been lethal to communities without that knowledge. The archaeological evidence of continuous human occupation through the last glacial maximum in the Australian interior is evidence of one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of applied human intelligence in the evolutionary history of our species. The rock art of the arid interior records some of this history in ways that we are only beginning to learn to read. The Carnartukel site, also known as Serpent's Glen, in the Little Sandy Desert of Western Australia, contains engravings of a style and a subject matter that have been argued to represent a tradition going back more than 10,000 years, including possible depictions of the now extinct megafauna that were present in the arid interior before and during the earliest human occupation. The stylistic sequences visible in the rock art of the arid interior suggest continuous traditions of artistic practice spanning tens of thousands of years, with each phase of the tradition building on and modifying what preceded it, while maintaining continuity with the foundational stylistic principles. This is not the art of a people moving through a landscape without attachment. It is the art of a people with deep roots in specific places, returning repeatedly to the same sites, maintaining the same artistic traditions across generations, accumulating on the surfaces of the rocks a visual record of their relationship with the landscapes they inhabited. The ethnographic record of the arid interior, much of it collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by anthropologists who worked with communities that had only recently been contacted by Europeans, provides complementary evidence of the civilizational depth of the communities that inhabited those landscapes. The ceremonial traditions of the Central Australian desert people, particularly the Aranda, Warlpiri and Luritja communities, were documented in extraordinary detail by researchers like Baldwin Spencer and Francis Gillen, who spent extended periods living with those communities and learning about their ceremonial life. What Spencer and Gillen documented, and what subsequent researchers have continued to document and analyze, is a ceremonial tradition of extraordinary complexity and depth. The secret sacred traditions of the desert communities, which are restricted in their transmission to appropriately initiated individuals, encode knowledge systems of great sophistication, including detailed cosmological narratives that explain the origin and structure of the world in terms of the journeys and actions of ancestral beings, detailed geographical knowledge of the territories through which those ancestral journeys passed, and detailed practical knowledge of the ecological and social relationships that structure life in the desert landscapes. The complexity and internal consistency of these knowledge systems is evidence of intellectual achievement of a high order. They are not simple stories told by simple people. They are sophisticated intellectual constructions maintained and transmitted by specialists through a carefully structured system of initiation and teaching, representing the accumulated intellectual work of communities over tens of thousands of years. The gendered dimensions of knowledge transmission in Aboriginal culture are another aspect of the intellectual architecture of the civilization that is often overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on the male ceremonial traditions, that were the focus of most of the early ethnographic attention. Women's ceremonial traditions in Aboriginal cultures are as complex and as intellectually rich as men's traditions, and they encode knowledge systems of comparable depth and sophistication. The women's knowledge systems of Central Australian communities, documented by researchers like Diane Bell in her work with Walpiri and Aranda women, include cosmological narratives of great complexity, detailed ecological knowledge of the landscapes relevant to women's economic activities, and social and legal knowledge of the relationships and obligations that structure women's lives and women's roles in the community. The ceremonial life of women is not a lesser version of men's ceremonial life. It is a parallel and complementary system of equal importance to the civilization as a whole. The total knowledge system of an Aboriginal community is the sum of both the men's and the women's traditions, and the depth and sophistication of that total knowledge system is accessible only to someone who has access to both dimensions of it. The dreaming tracks, which are the routes along which the ancestral beings traveled in creating the landscape, are not abstract cosmological narratives. They are geographical records. They encode the specific features of specific landscapes in the actions and experiences of the ancestral beings whose journeys created those features. A researcher who knows the dreaming narrative associated with a particular track can, if they have access to the landscape, identify the specific geographical features that correspond to specific events in the narrative. The dreaming narrative is a geographical description encoded in cosmological story. It is both religion and geography simultaneously, and the two dimensions are inseparable because the cosmological narrative is the technology by which geographical knowledge is preserved and transmitted across generations. A culture without writing cannot maintain a map library, but it can maintain a narrative tradition in which geographical information is embedded in stories that are sufficiently emotionally and aesthetically compelling to ensure their faithful transmission across generations. The dreaming is the map library of a civilization without writing, and it is, by the evidence of its accuracy across 12,000 years of documented geographical memory, a remarkably effective one. The precision of the geographical knowledge encoded in dreaming narratives has been documented in a number of research contexts. Researchers who have worked in regions with both detailed ethnographic documentation of dreaming traditions and detailed geographical surveys of the landscapes those traditions describe have consistently found high degrees of correspondence between the narrative descriptions and the physical features of the landscape. Water sources described in the narratives are real water sources. Geological features described in the narratives are real geological features. The routes of the ancestral journeys correspond to real geographical routes through the landscape, often routes that are optimal in terms of the resources they access, the water sources they connect, and the terrain they traverse. This correspondence is not coincidental. It is the evidence of a knowledge system that has been refined through thousands of years of practical engagement with the landscape, embedded in narrative form through a tradition of meticulous transmission and maintained with a fidelity to geographical accuracy that reflects the practical importance of that accuracy to the survival of the communities that maintain the tradition. The question of why the dreaming traditions have been so faithfully maintained across such long periods of time in the face of the disruptions of the colonial period and the social changes that accompanied it, is partly answered by the institutional structures that supported that maintenance. The ceremonial system that maintained dreaming traditions was not a voluntary or informal arrangement. It was a structured system of obligation, in which specific individuals were responsible for the maintenance and transmission of specific sections of the tradition, and in which the failure to fulfill that responsibility was a serious violation of law with real social consequences. The custodians of specific dreaming tracks were not self-appointed. They were designated by the tradition itself, by the kinship and territorial affiliations that assigned specific individuals the responsibility for specific sections of knowledge. This system of designated custodianship distributed the responsibility for knowledge maintenance across the community in a way that made the loss of any single individual much less catastrophic than it would have been if the knowledge were concentrated in a single repository. If one custodian died without having fully transmitted their knowledge to a successor, the loss was serious but not necessarily fatal to the tradition as a whole, because adjacent custodians held overlapping sections of the same tradition and could provide partial reconstruction of the missing section. The distributed custodianship system was a form of knowledge redundancy, deliberately designed to maximize the resilience of the tradition against the loss of individual practitioners. This institutional design is one of the most sophisticated aspects of Aboriginal civilization, and one that most accounts of that civilization fail to adequately appreciate. When we describe Aboriginal knowledge as oral tradition, we are using a term that implies a certain informality and vulnerability, a knowledge system that exists only in memory, and that is therefore inherently fragile. But the institutional structure that surrounds and supports Aboriginal oral tradition is anything but informal or fragile. It is a deliberately designed, consciously maintained, institutionally enforced system of knowledge management that has been refined over tens of thousands of years to maximize the resilience of the knowledge it preserves against the disruptions that human communities inevitably experience over such long timescales. The knowledge survived the disruptions of the last glacial maximum. It survived the ecological changes of the Holocene. It survived the contact period in many communities, at least partially, despite the most sustained and deliberate attempt to destroy it that has yet been mounted against any knowledge system in human history. It survived because it was built to survive, built by people who understood what knowledge meant and what its loss would cost, and who designed institutional structures specifically for the purpose of ensuring its survival across the longest timescales that human experience could contemplate. The recognition of this civilizational achievement is still incomplete. It is still partial. It is still contested by institutional inertia and by the political and economic interests that have always been served by the fiction of terra nullius and the myth of the primitive. But it is growing. The evidence is too strong and too abundant to be permanently suppressed. The scientific community, increasingly in partnership with Aboriginal communities, rather than in the extractive relationship that has historically characterized that interaction, is producing a picture of Australian prehistory that is more detailed, more complex, and more impressive with each passing year. The educational institutions that have, for most of their history, taught Australian children a version of Australian history that began in 1788 are slowly, imperfectly, beginning to incorporate the 65,000 years that precede that date. The legal and political institutions of the Australian state are, however slowly and however incompletely, beginning to grapple with the implications of the oldest civilization on Earth, having been declared not to exist on the land on which that state was founded. None of this is happening fast enough. The knowledge losses of the colonial period are irreversible in many cases, and the rate of further loss is still alarming. As the last holders of specific knowledge traditions age and die without the institutional support necessary to ensure adequate transmission to successors, the ecological losses of the colonial period are even more difficult to reverse because the landscapes that Aboriginal knowledge systems were developed to manage have been so extensively altered that even communities with intact knowledge are managing different landscapes from those their knowledge describes. The legal and political recovery of Indigenous rights is proceeding at a pace that is insulting to the scale of the injustice it is attempting to address, impeded at every stage by the institutional resistance of a settler colonial state that has always been more comfortable managing the legacy of its founding fiction than honestly reckoning with it. But the direction of travel is clear. The truth about what existed in Australia before 1788 is not going back into the silence that the colonial project tried to impose on it. The fish traps at Brewarina are not going to stop being the oldest human-made structure on Earth. The aquaculture at Budge Bim is not going to stop predating Stonehenge by more than 2,000 years. The 65,000-year date established at Majidbeebe is not going to be revised downward. The oral traditions that preserve geological memory across 12,000 years are not going to become less extraordinary because acknowledging their extraordinariness is inconvenient for the narratives that have been used to justify dispossession. The evidence is permanent. It is accumulating. It is telling a story that the textbooks have not yet told, but that the textbooks will eventually have to tell, because the evidence is too strong and too abundant and too consistent to be permanently denied. That story is this. Before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before writing, before civilization, as it is usually defined and taught and celebrated in schools and universities and museums around the world, in a place that the people who arrived there 65,000 years ago had no name for, because there were no human words yet to describe it, the oldest civilization on Earth was beginning. It began with people looking at an unknown continent and beginning to learn it. And for 65,000 years, they learnt it. And they managed it. And they sustained themselves on it. And they built a civilization from that knowledge. A civilization without cities, but with something more valuable than cities, which was the knowledge of how to live sustainably in a specific place for a specific time that was not 5,000 years or 10,000 years, but 65,000 years. A civilization that knew its landscape so intimately that it could preserve geological memories across 12,000 years. A civilization whose knowledge of water and food and fire was so deep that it sustained human life through conditions that would have been lethal to any community without that knowledge. A civilization whose social and institutional architecture was so sophisticated that it maintained continental-scale governance and knowledge management without a central government, without coercion, and without anything that the European tradition would recognize as the instruments of civilization. And then, in the space of approximately 150 years, a legal fiction was invented. The land was declared empty. The civilization was declared not to have existed. The people who had built it across 65,000 years were declared to be primitives at the earliest stage of human development, useful to science as specimens of what all humanity had once been, but not useful to the colonial project as evidence of what they themselves had achieved. The declaration was wrong. The evidence has always shown that it was wrong. The recovery of that evidence, the reconstruction of the true story of what existed in Australia before 1788, is the most important unfinished work in the history of a country that still does not fully know itself. It is work that is being done, slowly, imperfectly, by scientists and historians and legal scholars, and most importantly, by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who are the living inheritors of the civilization that was declared not to exist. Their knowledge, their languages, their ceremonies, their relationships with their countries, their institutional structures, and their knowledge management systems, and their ecological management practices are not relics of a dead past. They are the living expression of the oldest civilization on Earth, still active, still accumulating, still adapting to the conditions of the present, still insisting on the reality of what was built and what was lost and what has survived. The oldest civilization on Earth is not gone. It is here. It survived the most sustained attempt to erase it that the modern world has yet produced. It survived because it was built to survive. Because the knowledge it embodies is true. Because the relationship it encodes between a people and their country is real and durable in ways that a legal fiction cannot permanently undo. Because the fish traps are still in the river and the stone channels are still in the volcanic landscape and the songs are still being sung and the fires are still being lit in the old patterns on the old landscapes, and because the truth in the long run is harder to suppress than the colonial project has found it to be. The oldest civilization on Earth is still here, still insisting on its existence, still building its case in the evidence of 65,000 years of human achievement, still waiting to be seen, truly and fully and honestly, for what it is. The first, the oldest, the most durable, the greatest survival story in the history of the human species. That is the version the evidence tells. That is the story that was left out of the textbooks. And now you have heard it. There is a conversation that happens in Aboriginal communities across Australia between elders who hold knowledge and younger people who are trying to learn it. It is a conversation that has been happening for 65,000 years, the conversation through which a civilization passes itself from one generation to the next. It is not always easy. It has never been easy. Knowledge of the depth and the complexity that Aboriginal civilization has developed does not transfer automatically or effortlessly. It requires commitment from the learner and dedication from the teacher. It requires repeated engagement with the landscapes and the ceremonies and the social relationships in which the knowledge is embedded. It requires, in many cases, years or decades of sustained apprenticeship before the full depth of a knowledge tradition becomes accessible to the learner. This is not a weakness of the system, it is a feature of it. Knowledge that is hard to acquire is knowledge that is taken seriously by the people who hold it. The difficulty of the transmission process is itself a signal of value, and it ensures that the people who hold the knowledge have invested enough in its acquisition to understand its importance and to be motivated to ensure its continued transmission. This transmission conversation is happening now, in communities across Australia, under circumstances that are more difficult than any generation before has faced. The disruptions of the colonial period have broken many of the transmission chains that carried knowledge from one generation to the next. The boarding school system, which removed children from their communities for years at a time during their most critical learning years, severed the connection between children and the elders who would otherwise have been teaching them. The mission system, which concentrated displaced community members from different countries in the same locations, created social conditions that disrupted the specific territorial relationships that gave particular knowledge traditions their meaning. The reserve system, which confined Aboriginal people to specific areas regardless of their territorial affiliations, further disrupted the relationship between knowledge holders and the countries their knowledge described. The protection boards, which regulated the movement of Aboriginal people and prohibited many ceremonial practices, made the formal transmission of knowledge through ceremony difficult or impossible in many communities for extended periods. The consequences of these disruptions for knowledge transmission are still visible today in the communities that are working hardest to revive and maintain their knowledge traditions. There are elders who hold knowledge that they learned from their own elders before the full force of the colonial disruption reached their communities, knowledge that has not been transmitted to any younger person in the community, knowledge that will be lost when those elders die if the transmission does not happen soon. There are communities that are racing against time, working to document the knowledge of their last fluent elders, to create records that can supplement, if not replace, the direct transmission that the colonial disruption made impossible. There are languages with fewer than 10 fluent speakers left, languages that encode cosmological and ecological knowledge that has no equivalent in any other language, knowledge that will be lost if those speakers die before they have passed it on. The urgency of this situation is real, and it is not adequately reflected in the pace of institutional support for knowledge revitalization. But the urgency is also evidence of the civilization's persistence. The knowledge that remains to be transmitted is knowledge that survived. It survived because specific individuals made the choice to hold it, to maintain it, to keep it alive against the pressures of a system that was telling them it was worthless and forbidding them to practice it. The survival of any Aboriginal knowledge tradition through the colonial period is an act of resistance. It is an assertion of the value of the civilization in the face of a systematic campaign to deny that value. And the communities that are now working to transmit that surviving knowledge to a new generation are participating in one of the most significant cultural recovery projects in human history. The language revitalization movements that are active in Aboriginal communities across Australia are a concrete expression of this civilizational recovery. More than 100 Aboriginal languages are still spoken today in varying degrees of vitality. The most vital are spoken by communities that maintained relatively continuous residence in their traditional territories and that were less severely disrupted by the colonial process than communities in more densely settled regions. The least vital are those that may have only a handful of remaining speakers and that require urgent intervention if they are to survive. The revitalization efforts that communities are undertaking include the creation of language documentation projects, which record the speech of fluent elders in formats that can be used for teaching. They include the development of language teaching materials for use in schools. They include the negotiation with state and territory governments for the inclusion of Aboriginal languages in school curricula. They include the establishment of language nests, immersive language learning environments modelled on the successful Maori Kohanga Reo experience in New Zealand, where young children can develop fluency in their ancestral language in a supportive and culturally appropriate setting. The results of these efforts are mixed, as results always are in the face of challenges of this magnitude. Some languages that were considered moribund, spoken only by a handful of elderly people, have been revived to the point of having young speakers who have learned the language from documentation and from the remaining elders. Others continue to decline despite best efforts, because the conditions that would make revitalization possible, particularly the sustained presence of children in close daily contact with fluent speakers, are difficult to create in communities that have been dispersed and disrupted by 2 centuries of colonial intervention. The success stories are real and they are significant. The Kaurna language of the Adelaide Plains, which had no fluent speakers at the time of its revitalization effort, has been reconstructed from historical documentation and is now taught in schools and spoken by a growing community of learners. The Darug language of the Sydney Basin, similarly reconstructed from historical records, is being taught and learned in the community that is working to reclaim it. These are not the same as the living tradition that would have existed without the colonial disruption, but they are something. They are the assertion that the language matters, that the knowledge it encodes matters, that the civilization it belongs to is not finished, that the oldest civilization on Earth is not consigning itself to the past. The relationship between language and knowledge is particularly important in the Aboriginal Australian context. The 250 or more languages that existed in Australia at the time of European contact were not simply different ways of naming the same world. They encoded different ways of understanding that world, different frameworks for organizing knowledge about ecology and astronomy and social relationships and cosmology that reflected the specific intellectual traditions of the communities that developed them over thousands of years in specific places. When a language dies, the world it describes does not simply continue to exist under a different name. The specific framings, the specific distinctions, the specific relationships and associations encoded in that language's vocabulary and grammar are lost. The knowledge they carried is lost. Not all of it can be recovered by translating the concepts into English, because some of the concepts are not translatable without significant loss of meaning, because they depend on associations and relationships that exist in the language itself and that have no equivalent in languages that were developed in entirely different ecological and cosmological contexts. The ecological vocabularies of Aboriginal languages are a particular case in point. The detailed knowledge of specific plant and animal species, of their behavior at specific times of year in specific places, of the ecological relationships between different species and between species and their physical environment, is encoded in language in ways that are not simply descriptive, but that carry embedded knowledge about the relationships and processes they name. The vocabulary of fire management in Warlpiri or Pitjantjatjara or Noongar carries within it knowledge about the types of fire, the conditions that produce them, the ecological effects they have, and the purposes they serve. That is not accessible to someone who knows only the English words that might translate the surface meanings of those terms. When a language with such a vocabulary dies, the ecological knowledge it carries becomes accessible, if at all, only through the painstaking work of documentation and analysis by researchers who work in close partnership with the last speakers of the language and who understand both the language and the ecology it describes well enough to identify and preserve what is in danger of being lost. This work is happening. It is not happening at the pace that the urgency demands, but it is happening. The documentation projects of AI Thesis, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, have created an archive of language and cultural knowledge recordings that represents one of the most valuable collections of endangered cultural heritage in the world. The work of linguists like Patrick McConville and Barry Alpha and many others, conducted in close partnership with Aboriginal community members, has produced grammars, dictionaries, and textual documentation for dozens of languages that would otherwise have left no recoverable record of their structure and vocabulary. The digital resources being created by community language centres across Australia are making knowledge available in forms that can be used for teaching and that can reach community members who are physically distant from the fluent, speakers who hold the living tradition. None of this is sufficient. All of it is valuable. And all of it is evidence of the ongoing vitality of a civilization that has every reason to have given up on itself and has chosen not to. The legal dimension of the recovery, while slower and more contested than the cultural dimension, has also produced real and significant changes. The Mabo decision of 1992, in which the High Court of Australia unanimously ruled that the doctrine of terra nullius had never validly applied to Australia, was a legal revolution. It was not simply a legal technicality. It was the formal acknowledgement by the highest court in Australia that the legal fiction on which the entire colonial project was founded was precisely that, a fiction. The High Court found that Australia had not been empty land when the British arrived. It had been land occupied by people with their own legal systems and their own relationships to the land. The arrival of the British had not extinguished those relationships everywhere and for everyone. In places where the connection between communities and their land had been maintained through continuous occupation and practice, that connection, which the law called native title, survived and could be legally recognized. The Native Title Act that followed the Mabo decision created a legal mechanism for the recognition of that survival. It has been imperfect, it has been slow. It has been subjected to legislative amendments that have reduced its effectiveness. The burden of proof placed on Aboriginal communities seeking native title recognition has been criticised by legal scholars and by the communities themselves as requiring a standard of evidence that is both historically and culturally unreasonable. The requirement to demonstrate continuous connection to country across the full period of colonisation in circumstances where the colonial process was specifically designed to disrupt and sever those connections means that the communities most severely disrupted by colonialism are the ones most likely to be unable to demonstrate the continuous connection that native title requires. The law is better designed to recognize the survival of connection in communities that maintained relatively undisrupted relationships with their countries than to acknowledge the reality that colonialism was specifically designed to disrupt exactly those connections that native title now requires to be demonstrated. Despite its limitations, the native title regime has returned meaningful rights to many Aboriginal communities. Hundreds of native title determinations have been made, covering approximately a third of Australia's landmass. Many of these determinations are non-exclusive, meaning that they recognise Aboriginal rights and interests alongside other rights and interests in the same land. But even non-exclusive recognition is a significant change from the terra nullius that preceded it. It is the formal acknowledgement that these communities have rights derived from their own law and their own relationships to their country, rights that exist independently of anything that the Australian state has granted them, rights that are prior to the Australian state itself because they predate it by tens of thousands of years. The return of lands to Aboriginal communities, through native title, and through other mechanisms, including direct transfers and co-management arrangements, has in a number of cases produced demonstrable ecological benefits. Communities with legal recognition of their relationship to their country, and with the resources and the institutional support to exercise management responsibilities in that country, have in several documented cases achieved ecological outcomes that the preceding management regime, from which those communities were excluded, had failed to achieve. The reintroduction of fire management is one example. The restoration of habitat for threatened species is another. The control of invasive species through management regimes informed by traditional ecological knowledge is another. In each of these cases, the practical knowledge that the communities hold about their specific landscapes has proven valuable in ways that validate the civilizational achievement that produced that knowledge. The knowledge is not obsolete. It is not irrelevant to the modern world. It is, in many cases, the best available tool for managing the specific landscapes it was developed to manage, even after 2 centuries of alteration by the colonial land management regime that replaced it. The co-management model that has developed in a number of protected areas across Australia, in which Aboriginal communities and government agencies share management responsibilities and in which traditional ecological knowledge is formally incorporated into management decision-making, is one of the most promising developments in the practical recovery of Aboriginal civilizational values. Kakadu National Park, jointly managed by the Australian government and the Bininj and Mungai peoples, is among the most celebrated examples. The management of Kakadu incorporates traditional ecological knowledge of fire, of seasonal resource management, of the relationship between specific species and specific landscape features, in ways that produce ecological outcomes demonstrably superior to what conventional protected area management achieves in comparable landscapes without that knowledge input. The Kakadu model has been influential in shaping co-management arrangements elsewhere in Australia and has attracted international attention as an example of the practical value of integrating Indigenous knowledge with contemporary conservation management. Similar co-management arrangements are developing in marine environments, where the traditional sea country knowledge of coastal and island communities is increasingly recognized as an essential complement to the scientific knowledge that conventional marine management brings. The sea country knowledge of communities like the Yolngu of northeast Arnhem Land, who have managed their marine territories for tens of thousands of years, encompasses detailed knowledge of seasonal movement patterns of fish and marine mammals, of the relationships between different species and different habitat types, of the ecological effects of different harvesting practices, and of the indicators that the health of a marine ecosystem is declining. This knowledge, which has been accumulated through direct observation and practical management across a period that vastly exceeds the duration of any scientific monitoring program, represents a baseline against which the ecological changes of the colonial period can be assessed, and a guide for the restoration of marine ecosystems that have been degraded by unsustainable harvesting and habitat destruction. The recognition of the sea country dimension of Aboriginal civilization, which predates Stonehenge by many thousands of years, and which managed some of the most complex and productive marine ecosystems on Earth, is still in early stages. The archaeology of the Australian continental shelf, which was above sea level for most of the period of human habitation in Australia, and which therefore contains the physical remains of coastal communities that were living on what is now the seafloor, has barely begun. The technical challenges of underwater archaeology in the Australian context are significant. The depths at which the Pleistocene shorelines now lie, typically between 50 and 120 meters below the current sea surface, are at the outer limits of practical underwater archaeological investigation with current technology. But the potential significance of the sites that may exist on that submerged landscape is extraordinary. The communities that lived on the continental shelf during the Pleistocene had access to the most productive environments in the continent, the coastal zones where the concentrated resources of the sea and the land made high population densities possible. Their remains, buried under marine sediment for 10,000 years, may preserve evidence of a dimension of Australian civilization that is currently entirely invisible in the archaeological record. The investigation of those remains is a scientific frontier that is only beginning to be explored. The deep-sea dimension of the story connects to a broader point about what we do not know. The evidence that has been assembled about Australian civilization before 1788 is, for all its richness and for all its implications, the residue of what could not be destroyed, or what was preserved by chance, or by the specific conditions of particular sites. The vast majority of the physical evidence of 65,000 years of human civilization in Australia has been lost. Wooden structures have rotted. Organic materials have decomposed. Paintings on perishable surfaces have faded and vanished. The coastal sites that were the locations of the densest and most complex human communities for most of Australian prehistory are now under the sea. The knowledge systems that existed in the minds and the practices of communities that were disrupted or destroyed by the colonial process are gone with those communities. What remains is a fraction, and even that fraction is enough to establish that what existed was extraordinary. The imagination of what existed in full, if that fraction is indicative of the whole, is genuinely staggering. This is why the standard comparison with other ancient civilizations consistently understates the achievement. When we compare Aboriginal Australian civilization with ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, we are comparing what Egypt and Mesopotamia chose to build, the kinds of physical monuments and documentary records that survive in their specific climatic and geological conditions, with what Aboriginal Australia happened to leave behind in the specific conditions of the Australian continent. Egypt, built in stone, in a dry climate, its monuments survive. Aboriginal Australia, built in knowledge and practice and landscape management. Its monuments are the landscapes it managed, the knowledge systems it created and transmitted, and the communities that maintain those systems across 65,000 years. The survival conditions for these different kinds of monument are very different. Stone survives in dry climates for millennia. Knowledge requires living communities with institutional support for its transmission. The comparison is not between equals, not because one civilization was lesser, but because the evidence conditions favor the civilization that built in stone over the civilization that built in knowledge. If we adjust for this evidence bias, if we try to imagine what the full picture of Australian civilization would look like if it had left the same kind of physical record as Egypt, the picture becomes even more extraordinary. A civilization that managed a continent for 65,000 years would, if it had built in stone, have covered the Australian landscape with monuments of a scale and a complexity that would dwarf anything in the Old World. The Bujbim aquaculture system, if it had been constructed from cut stone in the Egyptian manner, would be as impressive a monument as the Karnak temple complex. The songlines network, if it had been inscribed on stone tablets, would fill a library larger than Alexandria. The knowledge system of 250 languages, if it had been written down, would constitute an encyclopedia of Australian ecological, astronomical, and cosmological knowledge that would take centuries to read. None of it was built in stone. None of it was written down. But that does not make it less real or less impressive. It makes it more fragile in the conditions that the colonial encounter created, and it makes the survival of any of it across that encounter the more remarkable. The question that the story of Australian civilization ultimately forces us to ask is a question about value. What do we value in human achievement? If we value the specific forms that achievement took in the civilizations of the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, the cities and the writing systems and the monumental architecture, then Australian civilization does not appear impressive. It did not produce those things. But if we value the actual achievements that those things were intended to produce, the organization of large communities for collective purposes, the management of resources for long-term sustainability, the transmission of knowledge across generations, the maintenance of social order across large territories without coercive force, the development of intellectual systems sophisticated enough to explain the world in ways that support practical action, then Australian civilization is among the most impressive that has ever existed. It achieved all of those things. It achieved them in forms adapted to the specific conditions of the Australian continent, and it achieved them across a time span that makes every other civilization look ephemeral. The civilizations of the ancient world that we celebrate in schools and universities and museums lasted for centuries or millennia. The Egyptian civilization lasted roughly 3,000 years before it was absorbed into successive empires. The Roman civilization lasted roughly 1,000 years in the West. The classical Maya civilization lasted roughly 600 years at its peak. Australian civilization lasted 65,000 years. By any honest measure of civilizational achievement, that duration is the most significant single fact. A civilization that lasts 65,000 years is not doing something wrong. It is doing something spectacularly right. It is the most successful demonstration of civilizational sustainability in the entire human record, and the civilization that achieved it was declared not to have existed at all. The declaration was wrong. The evidence shows that it was wrong, and the time has come to say so clearly and loudly and with the full weight of the evidence behind it. An entire civilization ruled Australia before Stonehenge was built. It ruled Australia before Egypt was founded. It ruled Australia for tens of thousands of years before the concept of civilization was invented by the people who would eventually use that concept to deny its existence. It built things that have lasted longer than anything built by the civilizations that claim to supersede it. It maintained knowledge systems of extraordinary sophistication across periods that make all of recorded history look like a footnote, and it was erased, legally and institutionally and through sustained violence, by a colonial project that needed it not to have existed. The erasure was real, but the civilization that was erased was real too. And the evidence of that reality is permanent, accumulating, and increasingly impossible to ignore. The version in the textbooks was a lie. The truth is this. And the truth, unlike the lie it is replacing, is as old as the hills, and as deep as the stone, and as enduring as the songs that have been sung across this continent for longer than any other human tradition has been singing anything anywhere on Earth. The specific sites that anchor this story deserve one more careful look, because they are not abstractions. They are places. Real places, on the ground, accessible to anyone willing to make the journey to them. And standing in those places, with the knowledge of what they represent, changes the experience of them in ways that matter. At Brewarina, on the Barwon River in far northwestern New South Wales, the fish traps that are the oldest human structure on Earth are still partly visible in the riverbed when the water is low. They are stones. Millions of individual stones, fitted together by human hands across a time span that makes the construction of the Great Wall of China look recent. Standing on the bank and looking at those stones, knowing what they are, knowing that they are older than any human construction anywhere else on Earth, The experience is not the experience of looking at ruins. Ruins imply something finished, something that was once active and has since ceased. The Brew Arena fish traps are not ruins. They are infrastructure that was interrupted. They were built to be maintained, and they were maintained for thousands of years. The interruption of their maintenance is a few generations old, a moment in the long history of their existence. The stones are still there. They still do what they were built to do: channel water, create differential flows, concentrate fish in specific locations. They are still, in the most literal sense, functional. What is missing is the community that maintained them, whose knowledge of how to use them and how to keep them in repair has been disrupted but not entirely lost. The Gunditjmara people at Bujbim are actively managing their aquaculture landscape under the authority of their World Heritage listing. The stone channels are being cleared of vegetation that has colonized them in the absence of maintenance. The weirs are being assessed for structural integrity. The holding pools are being mapped and described in the collaborative documentation projects that are building the record of what the system consists of and how it works. This is not archaeology in the sense of the study of something past. It is asset management. The Gunditjmara are managing infrastructure that their ancestors built more than 6,000 years ago. As the owners and operators of that infrastructure, with the formal recognition of the international heritage community that it is exactly what it is: a world-significant civilizational achievement that they built and that they have the right and the responsibility to manage. At Murujuga, the rock engravings that represent the world's largest body of rock art are being photographed, mapped, and documented by a combination of community knowledge holders and scientific researchers. The documentation project is creating a digital archive that will preserve the record of the engravings against the possibility of further physical damage. The community is asserting, through the political process and through the heritage management process, the right to protect the engravings from the industrial emissions that have been demonstrated to accelerate their erosion. The assertion is not only a legal and political claim, it is a civilizational assertion. The Murujuga rock art is not just old. It is the product of a continuous artistic and ceremonial tradition that has been maintained at that location for tens of thousands of years. The community that is asserting the right to protect it is the community that created it, or more precisely, the community that is the living continuation of the communities that created it across those tens of thousands of years. The right they are asserting is the right of the oldest civilizational tradition on Earth to protect its own most ancient expressions. These are not distant stories. They are not stories about the remote past that have no connection to the present. They are stories about places and communities that exist now, that are engaged now in the difficult and urgent work of recovering and maintaining a civilizational tradition that was declared not to exist and that survived that declaration anyway. They are stories about the resilience of human knowledge when it is embedded in living communities and maintained by people who understand its value and are committed to its survival. And they are stories that everyone who lives on or knows about the Australian continent has a stake in, because the knowledge that those communities are working to preserve is knowledge about the continent that everyone who lives there shares, whether or not they know it. The ecological knowledge of the oldest civilization on Earth is knowledge about the environment that everyone in Australia depends on. The survival and the revitalization of that knowledge is not only the concern of the communities that hold it. It is the concern of anyone who cares about the ecological future of the most ancient and the most distinctive inhabited continent on Earth. The story does not end here. It is not a story that has an ending, because it is the story of a civilization that is still alive, still developing, still learning from its own traditions and from its engagement with the wider world, still contributing to the understanding of what human beings are capable of when they commit themselves to knowing a specific place deeply and managing it wisely across the longest timescales that civilization has yet attempted. The oldest civilization on Earth is not a monument. It is not a historical artifact. It is a living tradition maintained by living people in living landscapes, across a living continent, and it was here before Stonehenge. It was here before Egypt. It has been here for 65,000 years, and it is still here now. The dawn over the Australian landscape is different from any dawn anywhere else on Earth. This is not sentiment. It is a measurable meteorological fact, a product of the continent's unique atmospheric conditions, the low humidity and the dust content of the air, and the angle at which the light crosses the horizon at these specific latitudes. It is a red dawn, saturated and deep, and it has been witnessed by human eyes every morning for 65,000 years. Every one of those dawns has been witnessed by people who belong to that landscape in the most complete sense that belonging is possible. People who knew the name of every feature visible from where they stood, who knew the history encoded in those names, who knew the ecological processes that would unfold in the hours after the light came, who knew the astronomical processes that had brought the sun back to this position in the sky on this day at this time of year, and what that meant for the management of the food and water and fire of their country. 65,000 dawns, each one witnessed by a community that understood it in the context of everything that had come before. The continuity of that witnessing, the unbroken chain of human attention to this specific landscape across 65,000 years, is itself an achievement of a kind that no other civilization has produced. Every other civilization that has existed on Earth began at some point, replaced something that came before it, and will at some point end or be replaced by something that comes after. The Aboriginal Australian civilization began at the beginning of human presence in Australia, and has not ended, despite everything that was done to end it. It is the continuous thread, the unbroken line, that connects the people who made the oldest ground edge axes 65,000 years ago at Majidbeeb to the people who are today singing the songlines in communities across the continent. That continuity is what the textbooks have most consistently failed to convey. The standard timeline of human civilization is presented as a story of progress, of successive developments, each one superseding the previous, each one more sophisticated and more complex than what came before. In this telling, Aboriginal Australians appear at the beginning of the timeline as an early and primitive stage that civilization has moved beyond, not as a civilization in their own right that has continued to develop and deepen across the entire span of the timeline. The timeline of human civilization, honestly told, does not leave Aboriginal Australia behind at its beginning. It contains Aboriginal Australia across its entire length, from the beginning to the present day, as the longest-running expression of human civilizational capacity that has ever existed. The practical implications of recognizing this are significant. If we recognize that the Aboriginal Australian knowledge systems accumulated across 65,000 years of careful observation of a specific continent represent the most detailed and the most accurate ecological knowledge of that continent that has ever been developed, then the integration of that knowledge into the management of Australia's environment becomes not a matter of cultural sensitivity, but a matter of practical necessity. The fires that are burning more catastrophically across Australia in the modern era are burning more catastrophically, partly because the management system that kept them in check for 65,000 years has been disrupted. The water systems that are degrading across the continent are degrading partly because the management intelligence that maintained their ecological health for 65,000 years has been excluded from the decisions about how to use them. The species that are going extinct in Australia at rates that are among the highest of any continent on Earth are going extinct partly because the management practices that maintained their populations for 65,000 years have been replaced by management regimes that lack the knowledge base to perform the same function. The recovery of Aboriginal management knowledge is not only a cultural imperative, it is an ecological imperative. Australia is facing environmental challenges of a severity that conventional management has so far been unable to adequately address. The integration of 65,000 years of accumulated ecological knowledge about the Australian continent into the management of that continent's future is not a romantic gesture toward the past. It is the most pragmatic response available to the challenge of managing the most ecologically distinctive and most environmentally variable inhabited continent on Earth. The civilization that was declared not to have existed contains within it the knowledge that Australia most urgently needs for its future. Recognizing that civilization for what it is, and learning from it rather than continuing to ignore it, is among the most practically important things that Australia could do. The recognition is growing. The institutional acknowledgement is slow, but it is happening. The scientific engagement is deepening. The legal framework is evolving. The educational account is beginning to change. And underneath all of this, in the communities across the continent that have maintained their knowledge and their languages and their relationships with their countries against the most sustained attempt to destroy them that the modern world has produced, the civilization itself continues. It is older than Stonehenge. It is older than Egypt. It is older than every civilization that the standard account of human achievement recognizes. It predates writing. It predates the city. It predates agriculture in the conventional sense. It is the oldest continuous human achievement on Earth, and it is still here, still insisting on its reality, still speaking its languages and singing its songs and managing its fires and teaching its children and maintaining its relationships with its countries. The oldest civilization on Earth is not a historical artifact, it is a living reality. And it was here before Stonehenge was built, before the pyramids were raised, before a single stone was placed on another in any of the monuments that the standard account of human civilization celebrates as the beginning of human achievement. It was here, building something more durable and more sophisticated and more ecologically intelligent than any of those monuments. It is still here, and it deserves to be seen. The dawn keeps coming. Every morning, the red light crosses the same horizon it has crossed for 65,000 years of human witnessing. The songs that describe what that light means, that encode the knowledge of what it signals and what it requires of the people who see it, are still being sung. The oldest civilization on Earth is still here, still insisting on being seen, still older than Anit.